The enemy sniper exhaled slowly behind his scope, savoring the moment before he pulled the trigger on the one man standing between his fighters in a massacre. He did not know the name Daniel Hayes. He never would. But in the instant his bullet tore through that soldier and sent his rifle skidding into the darkness, the man responsible for turning this mountainside into a slaughter was about to make the worst mistake of his life, because somewhere in the rocks below, a woman nobody had ever trained for war was already moving toward that fallen weapon. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Please hit subscribe, tap that bell, and stay with me all the way to the end of this story, because I promise you what happens next will stay with you long after the video ends. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's begin. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan did not care who lived and who died that night. They never had. For 3 hours, 7 American soldiers had been trapped in a crossfire that should never have happened, pinned against a wall of jagged rock with nothing but darkness and gunfire between them and the enemy closing in from 3 directions. Their helicopter, a burning skeleton of twisted metal 200 yards down the ridge, had been the first thing to die. Everything after that had been a fight for survival, minute by minute, breath by breath. Team leader Jake Morrison pressed his back against a boulder, blood running down his forearm from a graze he hadn't even noticed until now. He keyed his radio voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire for the better part of an hour. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6. We are pinned down. I say again, pinned down, requesting immediate air support over." Static answered him. Then faintly a voice crackled through. "Ghost 1-6 air support is 40 minutes out. Hold position." 40 minutes. Jake looked at his team. Ryan Cole, the medic, was pressed flat against the rock beside him, his hands shaking as he packed a field dressing into his kit ready for whoever went down next. 2 other operators, Mike Alvarez and Sam Brooks, were trading fire with muzzle flashes on the ridge above their rifles, barking in short, controlled bursts. And up on the rocky outcrop that gave them their only real advantage, Corporal Daniel Hayes lay flat on his stomach, his rifle steady, his breathing slow, doing the one thing that had kept them alive this long, picking off anyone who tried to flank them. 40 minutes, Jake muttered under his breath. "We don't have 40 minutes. He was right. Down below, hidden in a crevice of rock with a crate of ammunition strapped across her back, 25-year-old logistics specialist Emily Carter pressed herself as flat as she could against the stone and tried to remember how to breathe. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. Not in the middle of a firefight, not close enough to hear the individual cracks of rifles, not close enough to smell burning fuel and gunpowder mixing in the cold night air. She had been assigned to this extraction as support only. Carry supplies, stay behind the operators, do not engage. Nobody had planned for the helicopter to go down. Her hands were trembling around the strap of the ammunition crate, and every few seconds her eyes flicked toward Daniel Hayes on the ridge above her, the one man whose steady rifle fire was the only thing standing between this team and being completely overrun. She didn't know him well, a few words exchanged in a mess hall once nothing more. But right now, in this moment, he felt like the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. Then she saw movement in his silhouette, something in the way he shifted, exposing just a sliver more of his shoulder than he should have, and Emily's stomach dropped before her mind even understood why. "Get down," she whispered, though there was no way he could hear her. "Get down, get down, get down." The shot came from somewhere far across the valley, a single sharp crack that was somehow louder than everything else. Louder than the machine gun fire, louder than the shouting, because it was the sound that changed everything. Daniel's body jerked. For a half second, nothing happened. Time seemed to hang there suspended as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then he collapsed. "Hayes is hit," Mike Alvarez screamed from behind his rock. "Hayes is down." Emily watched in horror as Daniel's rifle slipped from his grip, sliding across the whetstone, tumbling down the rocky slope, bouncing once, twice, before it disappeared into a shadowed gap between 2 boulders roughly 30 feet from where she was hiding. 30 feet. It might as well have been 30 miles. "Cole, get up there!" Jake shouted, already moving toward the ridge himself, bullets kicking up dust inches from his boots. Cover him now." Ryan Cole scrambled up the rocks under a hail of covering fire from Sam Brooks, throwing himself down beside Daniel's motionless body, hands already moving checking for a pulse, tearing open his jacket to find the wound. "He's alive," Cole screamed over the chaos. "He's alive, but he's losing a lot of blood. I need to get pressure on this now." "Then do it." Jake fired 3 rounds toward a muzzle flash on the opposite ridge, ducking back down as return fire chewed into the rock beside his head. "Do it fast." But even as Cole worked to keep Daniel breathing, the real crisis was unfolding 30 feet away in the gap between 2 boulders, where a sniper rifle now lay abandoned in the dark. Without that rifle, the team had no eyes, no precision, no way to stop the enemy fighters who were already beginning to move, shadows shifting along the ridgeline, closing the distance meter by meter, sensing that whatever had been holding them back was suddenly gone. Jake understood this faster than anyone. He had seen firefights turn in seconds when the one thing keeping an enemy honest disappeared. And right now, that thing was lying in the open, exposed, useless to anyone who couldn't reach it. He looked around at his team. Alvarez and Brooks were both fully engaged, trading fire with 2 separate positions, unable to move without dying. Cole was elbow deep in Daniel's chest wound, the only thing standing between their sniper and bleeding out completely. And Jake himself was pinned so low behind his own cover that so much as lifting his head brought a spray of bullets close enough to feel the wind off them. There was no one who could reach that rifle. Jake felt something close to panic rising in his throat, an emotion he had trained for years to suppress, and it broke free of him in a single desperate shout that cut through the gunfire and echoed off the rock walls of the valley. "We need that rifle now." For a moment, nobody moved. The words hung in the night air like a challenge nobody could answer. Alvarez kept firing. Brooks kept firing. Cole kept his hands pressed against Daniel's wound, refusing to let go even as tears mixed with sweat on his face. Every single trained operator on that mountainside was already locked into a battle they could not walk away from, and the one thing that could save them all was lying in the dirt 30 feet from anyone who could actually use it. Emily Carter heard the shout. She felt it in her chest before she understood it in her mind, a vibration of desperation that cut straight through the roar of gunfire and the pounding of her own heartbeat. She was still pressed against the rock, still holding that ammunition crate like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the ground. And for a moment, her entire body screamed at her to stay exactly where she was. "You are not a soldier," a voice in her head insisted. "You are not trained for this. You count bullets. You do not fire them." But her eyes kept drifting to that gap between the boulders. 30 feet. She could see the outline of the rifle in the moonlight, just barely a dark shape against pale stone. Stay down, stay down, stay down. And yet some other part of her, some part she had never fully understood or trusted, was already calculating distance, cover, timing, the way the enemy fire was concentrated on the ridge above, rather than the low ground where she was hiding. She thought of every night she had spent in that quiet firing range, back at base, the one nobody talked about, the one where Master Sergeant William Parker had watched her shoot with an expression she never quite understood at the time. She thought of his voice. "You are not defined by the job they gave you. You are defined by what you do when the moment finally comes." The moment had come. Every fiber of her training told her this was not her job. Every fear in her body told her she would die if she moved from this spot. And yet, as she watched Ryan Cole fighting to keep Daniel Hayes alive, as she heard Jake Morrison's desperate voice shouting into the night, as she understood with sudden and terrible clarity that dozens of enemy fighters were about to overwhelm a team of American soldiers because the one weapon that could stop them was lying unused in the dark, something inside Emily Carter shifted. She let go of the ammunition crate. It hit the ground with a soft thud, forgotten. And Emily Carter, 25 years old, a logistics specialist who had never fired a shot in combat in her entire military career, began to move. Let's rewind for a moment, because to understand what Emily did next and why it shocked an entire team of the most highly trained warriors in the United States military, you have to understand who she was before that night. You have to understand where she came from and what it cost her to become the woman crawling toward a dead man's rifle under enemy fire. Emily Carter grew up in a small town in Montana, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the winters were long and brutal, and the summers felt too short to make up for them. Her father, Robert Carter, had worked construction for nearly 20 years, building the kind of steady, quiet life that never made headlines but held a family together. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with hands that seemed permanently stained with sawdust and calluses that told the story of every roof he had ever raised. Then when Emily was 14 years old, a scaffolding collapse changed everything. Robert Carter survived, but his back never fully healed, and neither did the version of him that used to lift Emily onto his shoulders and carry her through the yard laughing. The man who came home from the hospital moved slower, spoke less, and carried a weight in his eyes that Emily didn't fully understand until years later. Her mother, Susan Carter, was a school teacher, the kind who stayed late grading papers and came home exhausted, but never let her students see it. After the accident, she picked up extra hours, took on tutoring jobs, in the evenings did whatever it took to keep the family afloat, while her husband slowly relearned how to walk without pain, shooting down his leg with every step. Emily watched all of this happen from the kitchen table doing her homework in the glow of a single lamp, while her parents whispered about bills in the next room thinking she couldn't hear them. She heard everything. "We'll manage," her mother would say, night after night. "We always manage." But Emily saw the toll it took. She saw her father's jaw tighten every time he had to ask for help lifting something. She saw her mother's hands shake with exhaustion some mornings before the coffee kicked in. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet suffering, Emily made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. She was going to do something that mattered. "I'm enlisting," she told her parents the week after she turned 18, standing in that same kitchen, her voice steadier than she felt. Her father set down his coffee cup slowly. "Emily," he said, his voice careful, "you don't have to prove anything to us." "I'm not doing it for you," she said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm doing it because I want to matter. I want to do something bigger than myself." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "The military is not something you do lightly. I know that." "Do you?" Susan Carter reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Emily, you are the most careful, most precise person I have ever known. You plan everything 3 steps ahead. Are you sure this is the life you want? Combat danger, the possibility that you might not come home." Emily thought about that question for a long moment, and then she gave an answer that surprised even herself. "I don't want combat," she said quietly. "I just want to matter. I want to be part of something that keeps people safe. If that means counting supplies in a warehouse somewhere, then that's what I'll do. But I want to serve." Her father studied her face for a long time, the way he used to study a blueprint before deciding whether a structure would hold. Finally, he nodded, though his eyes were wet. "Then you serve," he said, "and you make us proud." But basic training was harder than Emily expected, not because of the physical demands, though those were brutal enough, but because of the constant grinding uncertainty of not knowing where she belonged. She watched other recruits find their place quickly, the natural leaders stepping into command roles, the athletes excelling in physical training, the sharp shooters discovering their talent on the range within the first few weeks. Emily excelled at none of these things in any way that drew attention. What she was good at, quietly, methodically, was organization. She never lost track of a single piece of equipment. She never miscounted ammunition. She could look at a supply manifest and immediately spot a discrepancy that everyone else had missed. Her drill sergeant noticed this early, and by the end of basic training, her path had already been decided for her. Logistics. "You've got a mind for details, Carter," her sergeant told her during final evaluations. "Most soldiers, their eyes glaze over doing inventory. You actually seem to enjoy it." "I don't know if enjoy is the right word, Sergeant." "Well, whatever it is, you're good at it. Logistics needs people who don't make mistakes. A missing bullet, a miscounted crate of medical supplies, that can cost someone their life just as easily as a bad shot in combat. Don't let anyone tell you it's not real soldiering." Emily nodded and told herself she believed him. But some nights, lying awake in the barracks, she couldn't shake a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that she was watching the war from behind glass. She counted bullets that other people fired. She packed medical kits that other people used to save lives in the field. She was essential, she knew that, but she was never the one standing at the center of the moment that mattered. She told herself that was fine. She told herself that for almost 2 years. Then Master Sergeant William Parker walked into her life, and nothing about that story stayed the same. Parker was a legend on base, the kind of soldier whose reputation preceded him into every room. 2 decades of combat experience, multiple tours, a reputation for training some of the sharpest shooters the unit had ever produced. He was also, by most accounts, a man who didn't waste time on soldiers he didn't believe in. Emily first met him during a routine equipment inspection, standing in the supply room with a clipboard in her hand cataloging rifles that had come back from a training exercise. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on matching serial numbers to her manifest. "You missed one," he said. Emily looked up startled. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sir, Rifle 47, your manifest says it was returned this morning. It wasn't. Check again." Emily flipped through her paperwork, cheeks flushing, and found the discrepancy exactly where he said it would be. A transposed number, easy to miss, the kind of small error that most people would have glossed right over. "You're right," she said. "I'll correct it immediately." "Most people wouldn't have caught that if I hadn't pointed it out," Parker said. "But I've been watching your work for a few weeks now. You catch things other people miss, every time." "It's just paperwork, Sergeant." "It's precision," he corrected her. "It's an eye for detail most people simply don't have. Do you know how rare that is?" Emily shrugged, uncomfortable under the weight of his attention. "I count things. It's not exactly a skill that gets you a medal." Something shifted in Parker's expression, then something almost amused, though his voice stayed perfectly serious. "Carter, has anyone ever taken you to the range at night?" "The night range? No, Sergeant. I'm logistics. I qualify twice a year like everyone else, and that's the extent of it. Come by tonight, 2100 hours. I want to see something." Emily almost said no. She almost told him she had inventory to finish reports, to file a dozen good reasons to stay exactly where she was comfortable. But there was something in the way Parker looked at her, something that made her feel for the first time in a long time like someone was actually seeing her instead of just seeing her job title. She showed up that night. The range was empty except for the two of them, lit only by a scattering of low red lights that preserved night vision. Parker handed her a rifle and walked her through a series of basic positioning corrections, small adjustments to her stance, her grip, the way she settled the weapon against her shoulder. "Breathe," he told her, standing behind her. "Not fast, slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Find the pause between breaths. That's where the shot lives." Emily's first few shots were unremarkable. Then gradually something began to change. Her breathing slowed, her hands steadied. The chaos of thoughts running through her mind, the reports she still needed to file, the inventory discrepancies, all of it began to quiet, replaced by a strange, focused stillness she had never experienced before. "Again," Parker said softly. She fired. Again. She fired. By the end of the session, her groupings had tightened in a way that made even Parker raise an eyebrow, and he was not a man who impressed easily. "How long have you been shooting like this?" he asked. "I haven't," Emily said, genuinely startled by her own results. "I mean basic qualification, that's it." Parker studied her for a long moment and then said something that would echo in Emily's mind for the rest of her life. "A soldier is not defined by the job they were assigned. They are defined by what they do when the moment comes." "With respect, Sergeant, I was assigned logistics because that's what I'm good at." "You were assigned logistics because someone looked at a piece of paper and made a decision," Parker said. "I've been in this army for over 20 years, and I have never seen someone with your level of natural control behind a rifle who wasn't actively trying to develop it. That's not paperwork talent, Carter. That's something else entirely." Emily didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to dismiss it entirely, to go back to the comfortable, predictable world of supply manifests and inventory counts, where she knew exactly what was expected of her and exactly how to deliver it. But another part of her, a part she barely recognized, felt something stir that had been dormant for a very long time. "What are you suggesting?" she finally asked. "Evening training, off the books, unofficial, just between us. I want to see what you can actually become." "I already have a job, Sergeant." "This isn't about your job. This is about who you are underneath it." Emily refused at first. For nearly 2 weeks, she told herself she was too busy, too committed to her actual responsibilities, too uncertain about stepping outside the role she had built for herself. She told herself the logistics work mattered, that her father would be proud of the steady, essential job she was doing, that she didn't need to chase some fantasy about being a different kind of soldier. But she couldn't stop thinking about the way her breathing had slowed on that range, the way the chaos in her mind had quieted, the way for just a few minutes she had felt something that could only be described as pure, uncomplicated focus. She showed up to the next evening session without telling anyone why. Weeks turned into months. Parker pushed her harder than she had ever been pushed before, teaching her wind calculations, long-range ballistics, the mental discipline required to hold perfectly still for hours at a time while every muscle in her body screamed to move. She failed constantly. She missed shots that should have been easy. She grew frustrated with herself in ways that sometimes brought her to the edge of tears in the privacy of her own quarters. "You're being too hard on yourself," Parker told her one night after a particularly brutal session where nothing had gone right. "I missed 6 shots in a row, Sergeant." "6? And you'll miss plenty more before this is over. That's not failure, Carter. That's the process. Nobody becomes exceptional by getting everything right the first time." "Why does this even matter?" Emily finally asked, frustration boiling over. "I'm never going to use this. I'm logistics. I'll never be assigned to a combat role, you know that as well as I do." Parker was quiet for a long moment, studying her in the dim red light of the range. "I don't train people because I know exactly how they'll use what I teach them," he said finally. "I train people because I've learned that the moment always comes eventually. And when it does, you don't want to be standing there wondering if you could have been ready." Emily didn't fully understand what he meant by that. Not yet. Other soldiers began to notice her evening absences, and not everyone was kind about the whispers that followed. A few made comments in the mess hall questions dressed up as jokes about the logistics girl playing sniper, laughter that stung more than she let anyone see. She kept training anyway, telling herself it didn't matter what anyone thought, though some nights it mattered more than she wanted to admit. "They don't understand," Parker told her once, after she came to a session visibly upset following a particularly cruel comment from a fellow soldier. "They see a title, logistics. They don't see the person underneath the title. That's their limitation, Carter, not yours." It's hard not to let it get to me. I know. But let me tell you something I've learned in over 20 years of this life. The soldiers who talk the loudest about who deserves respect are rarely the ones who end up earning it when it actually matters. You keep training. Let your actions speak when the time comes. Emily didn't know it then, but Parker's words would prove more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. Nearly a year passed this way, evening sessions blending into a rhythm that became as natural to Emily as her daily logistics work. She grew steadier, more precise. Parker began introducing more advanced scenarios, simulated stress conditions, timed drills, exercises designed to test not just her accuracy but her composure under pressure. "Combat isn't calm, Carter," he told her during one particularly grueling session. "Your hands will shake, your heart will pound, people will be screaming. The question isn't whether you'll feel fear. Everyone feels fear. The question is whether you can function through it. And if I can't, then we keep training until you can." There was a night about 8 months into her unofficial training when everything nearly fell apart. Parker had set up a stress simulation, loud recorded gunfire blasting through speakers positioned around the range, designed to simulate the chaos of actual combat, while Emily attempted to maintain accuracy. Her first attempt was a disaster. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't steady the rifle. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps. She missed every single shot. She lowered the rifle, humiliated tears stinging her eyes despite every effort to hold them back. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I could, but I can't. This isn't me, Sergeant. I'm not built for this." Parker crouched down beside her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Do you know what I saw just now?" he asked. "A disaster. I saw someone who was terrified and kept pulling the trigger anyway. That's not weakness, Carter. That's exactly what courage actually looks like. Nobody who tells you they weren't afraid in combat is telling you the truth. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." "But I missed every shot." "This time," Parker said, "tonight you missed every shot. That doesn't mean you'll miss the shot that actually matters." Emily wanted desperately to believe him, but doubt clung to her for weeks afterward, a quiet, persistent voice reminding her that she was at her core, still the girl who counted bullets in a supply room, not the woman who fired them under fire. Then came Operation Iron Shadow, and everything Parker had spent nearly a year building inside her was about to be tested in a way neither of them could have possibly prepared for. The mission briefing had seemed almost routine when Emily first heard about it, a standard extraction operation to pull a Navy SEAL team out of a compromised position deep inside hostile territory. She wasn't assigned as an operator, obviously. She was assigned as logistics support tasked with managing ammunition resupply and equipment coordination for the operation. It was the kind of assignment she had handled dozens of times before. "You'll be well back from any actual engagement," her commanding officer assured her during the briefing. "This is a support role, standard procedure." Emily nodded, feeling that familiar, comfortable weight of a job she knew how to do settle over her shoulders. She packed her gear methodically that evening, checking and rechecking her equipment with the same precision she brought to every task, never imagining that within 24 hours, everything about that mission would spiral into something no amount of careful preparation could have anticipated. The helicopter carrying the extraction team lifted off in the dead of night, engines roaring against a black sky scattered with more stars than Emily had ever seen back home in Montana. She sat near the rear of the aircraft, ammunition crates secured around her, watching the SEAL operators check their gear with the kind of calm, practiced efficiency that came from years of experience she couldn't begin to match. Daniel Hayes sat across from her, his sniper rifle cradled carefully in his lap, running through what looked like a mental checklist of his own. "First time on an extraction like this?" he asked her, noticing her white-knuckled grip on the strap of her harness. "Is it that obvious?" He offered a small, reassuring smile. "A little. Don't worry. Support personnel almost never see direct engagement. You'll be in and out before you know it." Emily nodded, wanting desperately to believe him. She would remember those words for the rest of her life. 20 minutes into the flight, everything changed. A violent shudder ripped through the helicopter, throwing Emily hard against her restraints. The deafening screech of metals tearing against metal, drowning out every other sound in the cabin. Someone screamed. Someone else was shouting orders she couldn't fully process. The world outside the window spun sickeningly as the aircraft began a rapid, uncontrolled descent, warning alarms blaring in a chaotic symphony of sound that seemed to stretch time itself into something unbearably slow. Brace, brace, brace. The impact when it came felt like the entire world exploding at once. Emily didn't remember much of the crash itself, just fragmented sensations, the harsh jolt against her restraints, the smell of fuel and smoke, a ringing in her ears that drowned out every other sound for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. When her vision cleared, she found herself being pulled roughly from the wreckage by Jake Morrison, his face grim and focused, despite a gash bleeding freely above his eyebrow. "Move, move, move," he shouted, dragging her toward cover as the first shots began cracking through the darkness around them. That was the moment everything Emily thought she understood about her role in this mission fell apart completely. There was no clean extraction. There was no safe distance from engagement. There was only chaos, rock darkness, and the sound of gunfire closing in from every direction as the SEAL team scrambled to establish a defensive position around the burning wreckage of their helicopter. For nearly 3 hours after that, Emily watched a team of the most highly trained warriors in the United States military fight for their lives against overwhelming odds. And she found herself against every plan, every assignment, every expectation anyone had ever placed on her, right in the middle of it. And now, as she released her grip on that ammunition crate and began crawling toward a fallen sniper rifle 30 feet away, with enemy fire tearing through the darkness around her, and a team of Navy SEALs completely unaware that a logistics specialist was about to become the only thing standing between them and annihilation, Emily Carter was about to discover exactly what Master Sergeant William Parker had been trying to prepare her for all along. The rock beneath her hands was cold and slick with something she didn't want to think too hard about. She kept low-moving in short bursts the way Parker had drilled into her during 100 nighttime sessions, pausing behind whatever cover presented itself, listening for the rhythm of enemy fire before advancing another few feet. "Carter, what are you doing?" Jake's voice cut through the chaos, spotting her movement from his position near the ridge. "Get back down." "I've got this," she shouted back, not entirely sure she believed her own words. "Your logistics, get to cover." "There's nobody else." Emily's voice cracked with the strain of shouting over gunfire, but there was something steady underneath the fear. Something that surprised even her. "Cole's got Hayes. You and your team are pinned. I'm the only one who can reach it." Jake stared at her for a fraction of a second, disbelief and desperation warring across his face before a fresh burst of enemy fire forced him back behind cover, unable to argue further, unable to do anything but watch as a woman he had known for less than a week and attempted something that should have been impossible. Emily's hand closed around the cold metal of Daniel Hayes' rifle. For a moment, she simply knelt there, frozen the weight of the weapon somehow heavier than she expected. Heavier than every hour of training could have prepared her for. This wasn't a range. This wasn't a simulation with recorded gunfire blasting from speakers. This was real. The enemy fighters advancing along the ridgeline were real. The lives hanging in the balance were real. And the weapon in her hands, the same weapon that had killed a man not 20 minutes ago, in a war zone she never expected to find herself standing in, felt suddenly impossibly foreign. Her hands began to shake. "You don't discover who you are when everything is easy." Parker's voice echoed in her mind as clear as if he were kneeling beside her. "You discover who you are when people are counting on you." Emily raised the rifle. She settled it against her shoulder the way she had 1,000 times before, the mechanics of the movement so deeply ingrained in muscle memory that her body remembered even as her mind screamed in protest. She found the scope. She found her breathing slow, deliberate, the same rhythm Parker had drilled into her across nearly a year of nights nobody else knew about. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Find the pause between breaths. That's where the shot lives. Through the scope, the battlefield transformed into something entirely different than the chaotic blur of noise and darkness she had been experiencing for hours. Everything slowed, everything sharpened. She could see the muzzle flash of an enemy machine gun position roughly 200 meters up the opposing ridge. The gunner shifting his aim towards Sam Brooks's position, seconds away from turning the tide of this battle in exactly the wrong direction. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands trembled. But somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the overwhelming screaming uncertainty of a woman who had never imagined herself in this exact moment, something steadier took hold. Something Parker had spent nearly a year building inside her, one frustrating, exhausting session at a time. She adjusted for the wind exactly the way she had been taught. She exhaled. She found the pause. And Emily Carter, 25 years old, logistics specialist, the woman nobody had ever expected to matter, in a moment like this pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the valley like thunder. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, and Emily's stomach dropped with the sickening certainty that she had missed, that everything Parker had trained her for had failed her in the exact moment it mattered most. Then the enemy machine gun position went silent. Jake Morrison's head snapped toward the ridge, disbelief written across every line of his face as he watched the threat that had been closing in on Sam Brooks simply stop. "Did you see that?" Alvarez shouted, equally stunned. "Who took that shot?" Nobody answered because nobody could quite believe what they were seeing. Emily didn't have time to process what she had just done. Her training, or maybe something deeper than training, was already moving her toward the next threat, scanning the ridgeline through the scope with a focus she had never known she possessed. Another muzzle flash, another calculation. Wind distance, breath. She fired again, and again an enemy position went silent. The SEAL team's return fire, which had been desperate and defensive for hours, suddenly found room to breathe, room to reposition, room to fight back with renewed purpose, as the precision threat they had lost when Daniel Hayes went down was somehow impossibly back in play. "Where is that coming from?" Jake shouted, genuinely bewildered, now his eyes scanning every possible position his team occupied. And then he saw her, kneeling in the gap between two boulders 30 feet from where she had started, a sniper rifle steady against her shoulder, her face a mask of terrified, disbelieving concentration. The logistics specialist, the woman who counted bullets instead of firing them. Jake Morrison, a man who had led combat operations across multiple continents, who had seen soldiers freeze under fire and others rise to heroism, he never expected, felt something close to shock settle over him as he watched Emily Carter take a third shot and a fourth, methodically dismantling the enemy's advantage, one impossible shot at a time. "That's Carter," Alvarez said, disbelief thick in his voice. "That's the supply girl." "Not tonight," Jake muttered, watching her work the rifle with a precision that seemed to defy everything he thought he knew about her. "Not tonight, she isn't." Down in the gap between the boulders, Emily had no idea what the SEAL team was saying about her. She had no idea that her name was about to become something spoken with awe rather than dismissal, something that would follow her for the rest of her career. All she knew in that moment was the rhythm Parker had taught her. Breathe. Find the pause. Fire. An enemy fighter attempting to flank Ryan Cole's position, still working desperately to stabilize. Daniel Hayes dropped before he ever got close enough to be a threat. Emily's hands were still shaking, her heart still pounding hard enough to hurt, but something had settled into place beneath the fear. Something steady and certain that refused to let her stop. One shot, one decision, one life saved at a time. The tide of the battle, which had been turning inexorably against the SEAL team for nearly 3 hours, began impossibly to shift. But even as Emily fired shot after shot, even as the enemy advance slowed and then stalled entirely under the weight of precision, fire nobody had expected to see again, that night she had no idea that the hardest part of what she was about to face wasn't the battle itself. It was everything that would come after it. Because somewhere in the chaos of that mountainside, as Emily Carter continued firing with a steadiness that shocked every single member of an elite Navy SEAL team, a truth was settling into place that none of them could yet fully understand. The woman crouched in that gap between two boulders was no longer simply logistics support. She had become something else entirely. And when the sun rose over that valley the next morning, nothing about Emily Carter's life or the lives of the men she had saved would ever be the same again. 2 minutes. That was all it took for the entire rhythm of the battle to change, and Jake Morrison could not stop staring at the woman kneeling in that gap between the boulders, working a rifle like she had been born holding one. "Cole status on Hayes," Jake shouted, forcing his eyes away from Emily, forcing himself back into the role he was actually trained for. "He's stable, but barely," Ryan Cole's voice cracked with strain. "I've got the bleeding slowed, but he needs real medical attention. Jake, not a field dressing. If we don't get him out of here soon, it won't matter that he's breathing right now." "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, Jake keyed his radio again, voice raw. "We have a critical casualty. I need that air support moved up over static." Then a burst of broken transmission. "Ghost 1-6, be advised, air support now, estimated at 35 minutes. Hold position." 35 minutes might as well have been a lifetime. Jake slammed his fist against the rock beside him, frustration and fear boiling together into something close to rage. 35 minutes ago, they'd had a sniper holding the line. Now they had a bleeding soldier, a team scattered across dangerous terrain, and a logistics specialist who had somehow impossibly stepped into a role none of them had ever imagined for her. "Carter, can you hear me?" he shouted toward the boulders. "I hear you." Emily's voice came back tight with adrenaline, but steady enough to surprise him again. "How many rounds do you have left?" There was a pause. Jake watched her check the rifle, her hands moving with a competence that still didn't match the mental image he had of her carrying a supply crates around a warehouse. "I don't know exactly," she called back. "Hayes's mag was already half spent before he went down. Maybe 10 rounds, 15 at most." Jake felt his stomach drop. 15 rounds, against an enemy force that had already proven it had numbers to spare. "Make them count," he muttered to himself, then louder. "Make them count." Carter prioritized anything with a mounted weapon. "Copy that." Emily settled back into the rhythm Parker had drilled into her, scanning the ridgeline through the scope, searching for the next threat before it became the next casualty. Her hands were still shaking, a fine tremor she couldn't fully suppress no matter how hard she tried, but underneath the fear, something else had taken hold. A strange, focused calm that felt both completely foreign and somehow like coming home to a version of herself she never knew existed. She found a second machine gun position, this one further up the ridge muzzle, already swinging toward Mike Alvarez's exposed shoulder. There was no time to overthink it. Breathe, find the pause. Fire. The shot connected, and the machine gun went silent for the second time that night, the gunner's body slumping forward over the weapon. Alvarez, who had been half a second from taking a direct hit, threw himself sideways instinctively, only realizing after the fact that the threat had already been eliminated. "What the hell?" he gasped, staring up at the ridge where the enemy position had gone quiet. "Who is that?" "That's Carter," Brooks shouted back, disbelief thick in his voice. "That's the supply girl, I swear to God, that's Carter. The logistics girl just saved my life." "Focus, Alvarez," Jake barked. "Save the shock for later. We are not out of this yet." He was right, because 300 meters up the opposite ridge, a man who had been directing the enemy assault for the better part of 3 hours was beginning to notice something was very wrong. His name would never make it into any American report, never appear in any official record, But in that moment, the enemy commander lowered his own field glasses and stared hard at the ridge where his machine gun positions kept falling silent, one after another, with a precision that felt entirely different from the sniper fire that had been harassing his men for hours before. Different angle, different rhythm, different shooter. He barked something sharp in his own language to the two fighters crouched beside him, gesturing toward the boulders where the shots seemed to be originating from. The men nodded and began moving low and fast, shifting their approach away from the main firefight and toward a flanking route that would bring them dangerously close to Emily's position. Emily had no idea any of this was happening. She was still locked onto the ridge, searching for the next threat, when a fresh volley of gunfire suddenly erupted much closer than anything before, close enough that she felt rock fragments spray against her cheek from a round that struck the boulder inches from her head. She dropped instinctively, heart slamming against her ribs. "Carter, you good?" Jake's voice sharp with alarm. "I'm fine," she shouted back, though her voice betrayed exactly how not fine she was. "That was close. That was really close." "They're adjusting to your position," Jake realized, horror creeping into his voice as the tactical reality clicked into place. "They know where you are. Move, Carter. You need to move." "Move where?" Emily's voice cracked with something close to panic, now the calm she had built over the last several minutes fracturing under the sudden terrifying reality that she was no longer just providing cover fire. She was a target. Anywhere but there. Find new cover now. Emily's mind raced, Parker's voice cutting through the panic like a lifeline. You don't discover who you are when everything is easy. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to think past the animal fear screaming at her to freeze and scan the terrain around her position. 10 feet to her left, a slightly larger outcropping of rock offered better cover closer to the ground, harder to target from the angle the enemy seemed to be approaching from. 10 feet. It felt like a mile. Another burst of gunfire chewed into the rock where she had been kneeling only seconds before, close enough that she felt the heat of it, close enough that dust and shattered stone rained down across her shoulders. She moved. Every instinct in her body screamed to stay flat, to stay still, to make herself as small a target as humanly possible. But she forced herself into a low-controlled sprint, rifle clutched against her chest, throwing herself behind the new outcropping just as another round cracked into the space she had just vacated. For a moment, she simply lay there, chest heaving, heart pounding so hard it hurt the rifle still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Carter!" Jake's voice desperate. "Carter, talk to me." "I'm here," she gasped out. "I'm okay, I moved, I'm okay." Relief flooded through Jake's voice, but it didn't last long because in the same instant, Ryan Cole's voice cut across the radio with a different kind of urgency entirely. "Jake Hayes is crashing. His pressure's dropping. I need to get fluids into him now, but I've kits. My bag got hit during the crash. I don't have what I need." "What do you need?" Jake shouted back. "Trauma kit full. Trauma kit, we packed extras in the supply crate near the crash site. But that's exposed ground. I can't get to it without..." Cole's words cut off as a fresh burst of gunfire forced him to duck lower over Daniel's motionless body, his hands still pressed hard against the wound, blood soaking through the dressing faster than he could manage. The supply crate. Emily's mind snapped instantly to the memory of the crate she had abandoned near her original position, the ammunition and medical supplies she had been carrying before everything spiraled into chaos. It was still sitting there, exposed roughly 15 feet from her current position, dangerously close to the exact spot the enemy fighters seemed to be converging on. "I can get it," she said more to herself than anyone else before keying her radio. "Cole, I have supplies near my original position. I can reach the crate." "Carter, no." Jake's voice sharp with alarm. "That's exactly where they're converging. You just moved away from that position for a reason." "Hayes doesn't have time for me to think about this." Emily shot back and already moving before she had fully processed the decision, some part of her brain screaming that this was insane, while another part, the part Parker had spent nearly a year building, was already calculating the fastest route back toward that crate. "Carter, that's an order, stand down." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. She had spent her entire military career following orders, staying in her lane, doing the job she was assigned without question. Tonight, something inside her had already broken free of that pattern, and there was no putting it back now. She moved, low and fast, rifle slung across her back, scrambling across open ground toward the abandoned crate, while gunfire cracked around her in a rhythm that felt like the whole world screaming at her to stop. Her hands found the crate handle, and she yanked it hard, dragging it toward the cover of a nearby rock formation. Every muscle in her body braced for the impact of a bullet that by some miracle never came. She dropped behind cover chest heaving and tore the crate open with shaking hands. Trauma kits, extra ammunition. She grabbed what she could carry, stuffing supplies into whatever pockets and pouches were still empty, and began the desperate crawl back toward Cole's position, praying with every foot of ground she covered that her luck wouldn't run out before she got there. It very nearly did. An enemy fighter close enough now that Emily could hear his voice, shouting something in a language she didn't understand, rounded a rock formation directly in her path, weapon already rising. Time seemed to slow to nothing. Emily didn't have time to raise her rifle, didn't have time to think, to calculate, to do anything except react on pure instinct, throwing herself sideways as his first shot cracked past close enough to feel the air move beside her ear. She hit the ground hard, rifle scraping against rock, and in the half second before he could correct his aim, some part of her, the part that had spent nearly a year training in the dark with Parker's voice in her ear, took over completely. She brought the rifle up. She fired. The enemy fighter dropped. Emily lay there for a moment, staring at the space where he had been standing, her entire body trembling so violently she could barely hold herself upright. She had never taken a life at close range before. The machine gun positions on the ridge had felt almost abstract, distant shapes silenced from 100 meters away. This was different. This was close enough to see, close enough that some part of her would carry the memory of his face for the rest of her life. There was no time to process it. "Carter," Jake's voice desperate now. "Carter, report." "I'm okay," she gasped out, forcing herself back into motion, dragging the supplies the last few feet toward Cole's position. "I'm coming. I'm almost there." She reached Ryan Cole moments later, practically collapsing beside him as she shoved the trauma kit into his hands. "Here, I got what I could." Cole stared at her for half a second, something like awe cutting through the desperation on his face before he snatched the kit and tore it open, working with renewed speed to stabilize Daniel's condition. "You're insane, you know that," he said, not looking up from his work. "I've been told," Emily managed, still shaking, still trying to catch her breath. "No, I mean it," Cole said, finally glancing at her as he pushed fluids into Daniel's arm. "You just ran through open ground under fire to bring me supplies. That's not logistics. That's not anything close to logistics." Emily didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure she had an answer for any of what had happened in the last 15 minutes. "Is he going to make it?" she asked instead, looking down at Daniel's pale, unconscious face. "With this," Cole said, holding up the trauma kit, "he's got a real shot now. Without it, I don't know. I don't know if I could have kept him stable another 20 minutes. Somewhere behind them, Jake Morrison watched this entire exchange with an expression that had shifted in the span of 15 brutal minutes, from disbelief to something that looked almost like reverence. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, he said into his radio voice, steadier now than it had been in over an hour. "Be advised, we have a civilian support asset who has effectively assumed sniper duties and just resupplied our medic under direct fire. I need her name logged, and I need that air support moved up because whatever we're doing right now, it's working, but I don't know how much longer it'll hold." The radio crackled back with an official acknowledgement that felt almost absurdly bureaucratic, given everything happening on the ground, but Jake didn't care. He looked over at Emily, still catching her breath behind the rocks, and felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. But the night wasn't finished testing that theory. Because up on the opposing ridge, the enemy commander who had watched two of his machine gun positions go silent and one of his fighters fall to a single well-placed shot was no longer content to simply flank the American position. He was calling for reinforcements. Emily didn't know this yet. Nobody on the American side did. All she knew, kneeling back into position with 15 rounds remaining and hands that still hadn't stopped shaking, was that the fight was far from over. And somewhere out there, more enemy fighters were converging on a position that was already stretched thin. "Jake," Brooks called out from his position, voice tight with concern. "I'm seeing movement in multiple positions. This doesn't look like it's slowing down." Jake's stomach tightened as he risked a glance over his cover, and what he saw sent a fresh wave of dread through him. Shapes moving in the darkness more than before, converging from a direction that suggested reinforcements had arrived or had been called in the moment the tide of battle unexpectedly turned against them. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, Jake said again, urgency bleeding into every word. We are now observing enemy reinforcements. Repeat. Enemy reinforcements inbound. I need that air support immediately. We will not hold this position for 35 more minutes. The response when it came was not what he wanted to hear. Ghost 1-6 air support has been diverted. Repeat, diverted, due to a separate engagement in your sector. New estimated arrival time is 50 minutes. Advise you hold position and conserve ammunition. 50 minutes. Jake stared at his radio like it had personally betrayed him. 50 minutes, he repeated, disbelief and fury warning in his voice. 50 minutes, are they insane? Jake. Emily's voice, quieter now, cut through his spiraling panic. What do we do? He looked over at her, this woman who 20 minutes ago had been nothing more to him than an unfamiliar face assigned to carry ammunition crates, and felt the full weight of command settle onto his shoulders in a way it hadn't in years. We hold, he said finally. We hold and we make every single shot count, because 50 minutes from now, I want every single person on this mountainside going home. Emily nodded, though her hands were still shaking as she settled back behind the rifle. 15 rounds. Also 15 hands. An unknown number of enemy fighters now reinforced. A wounded man whose life depended on getting to real medical care before that 50 minutes ran out. And a woman who had spent her entire military career believing she would never be more than the person counting bullets in a supply room, now the only thing standing between an elite Navy SEAL team and total annihilation. Emily settled the rifle against her shoulder, forced her breathing to slow, and found once again the strange, focused calm that felt increasingly like the truest version of herself she had ever discovered. Breathe. Find the pause. The next several minutes unfolded in a blur of controlled chaos that would later feel in Emily's memory like watching herself from outside her own body. She fired when a target presented itself, conserving every round, with a discipline that surprised even her watching through the scope, as enemy movement slowed under the pressure of an opponent they could no longer predict. Then, without warning, a new sound tore through the night. A distinct, heavy whoosh that Emily didn't immediately recognize, but that sent every SEAL on that mountainside into an instant, visceral panic. RPG! Alvarez screamed. Nah, incoming, take cover now! The explosion when it hit wasn't a direct strike, but it was close enough to send a shockwave rolling across the position, close enough to knock Emily flat against the rock, ears ringing, dust and debris raining down around her. For a moment, everything went white. When her vision cleared, Emily's first thought was for Daniel and Cole, still exposed near the crash site, still working through the delicate process of keeping a critically wounded man alive. Cole, she screamed, scrambling to her knees despite the ringing in her ears. Cole, are you hit? We're okay. Cole's voice came back shaky but intact. That was close, way too close, but we're okay. Jake was already back on the radio, voice pitched with an urgency that hadn't been there even a few minutes ago. Command, they have RPGs. Repeat, enemy forces now have rocket-propelled grenades. We are taking direct fire on our position. I need that air support immediately. This is now a critical situation. The response was slow to come, and when it did, it offered no comfort. Ghost 1-6 air support, still estimated at 45 minutes. Recommend you fall back to a more defensible position if possible. Jake's laugh when it came held no humor in it at all. Fall back, he muttered. To where exactly? He looked around at his team, scattered across a mountainside under increasingly heavy fire, a wounded man clinging to life ammunition running low, and now the added terror of explosive weapons that could end this entire fight in a single lucky strike. There was nowhere to fall back to. There was only forward, only holding, only surviving one impossible minute at a time until help arrived, if it arrived at all. Everyone stay low, Jake shouted. Watch for a second. RPG position. They'll try to fire again from a different angle. Don't give them a clean shot. Emily forced herself back into position, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay flat against the rock. Forced her hands to steady, forced her breathing to slow once more. She scanned the ridgeline through the scope, searching desperately for any sign of the RPG operator, knowing that if she didn't find him before he found a clean angle, the explosion that had knocked her flat might be nothing compared to what came next. There, a figure crouched behind a rock formation, reloading what was unmistakably a rocket launcher, his silhouette just barely visible against the pale stone behind him. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a machine gunner threatening to pin someone down. This was a weapon capable of ending multiple lives in a single strike, and she had at most a few seconds before he finished reloading and found his angle. Breathe. She adjusted for wind, for distance, for the slight elevation change between her position and his. Find the pause. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly lost the shot entirely, forcing herself to steady them through sheer will, through the memory of Parker's voice telling her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, that courage was acting despite it. She fired. The shot connected exactly as the enemy fighter completed his reload, sending the rocket launcher clattering uselessly to the ground as he collapsed beside it. The threat for now was neutralized. RPG position down, Jake shouted, disbelief thick in his voice as he watched the entire exchange unfold. Carter, that's 2 lives you just saved in the last 5 minutes. Do you understand that? Emily didn't answer immediately, too focused on scanning for the next threat, too aware that this fight was far from over, that 50 minutes still stretched ahead of them, like an impossible distance to cross. But somewhere in the back of her mind, Jake's words registered, and something inside her, something that had spent her entire career believing she would never matter, beyond a supply manifest, began to shift in a way she wouldn't fully understand until much later. The enemy commander, watching his forces suffer loss after loss, to a shooter he still couldn't fully identify, made a decision in that moment that would prove to be the turning point of the entire battle, though not in the way he intended. He committed the remainder of his reserve force to a direct assault. If precision fire was going to keep picking off his men one by one, he reasoned, then the solution was overwhelming numbers, a full frontal push that would force the Americans to spread their defense too thin to hold, forcing that precision shooter to choose between targets faster than they could react. It was, in some ways, a sound tactical decision. It very nearly worked. The assault, when it came, arrived like a wave breaking against the mountainside, gunfire erupting from what felt like every direction at once, enemy fighters advancing in coordinated groups that pushed the SEAL team's defenses to their absolute limit. They're pushing hard, Brooks shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of holding a position that suddenly felt impossibly exposed. Jake, I don't know if we can hold this. We hold, Jake roared back, though even his voice carried an edge of desperation now. We hold because there is no other option. Emily fired and fired again, her remaining rounds dwindling with terrifying speed as she tried to prioritize the most immediate threats, tried to keep the enemy advance from overwhelming positions she knew her teammates couldn't defend alone. 5 rounds, 4, 3. I'm running dry, she screamed toward Jake, panic finally breaking through the composure she had fought so hard to maintain. I've got 3 rounds left, maybe 4. Make them count, Jake shouted back, though the words carried little comfort, given the reality of what 3 rounds could accomplish against an assault of this scale. Emily's mind raced Parker's training, warring against raw animal panic, as she tried to identify which threats mattered most, which shots would save the most lives with the ammunition she had left. A group of enemy fighters, at least 4 strong, was pushing hard toward Alvarez's position, close enough now that hand-to-hand combat had felt like a genuine possibility within the next 60 seconds. She had 3 rounds, 4 fighters. The math didn't work, and Emily felt something close to despair threatening to overwhelm her as she raised the rifle one final time, knowing that whatever happened in the next few seconds might determine whether Mike Alvarez lived to see morning. She fired. 1 fighter dropped. She fired again. A second fighter stumbled, wounded, but not down, still advancing despite the injury. 1 round left. 2 fighters still closing on Alvarez's position, close enough now that Emily could see the desperate, focused fear on his face as he realized his rifle alone might not be enough to stop what was coming. Emily's hands trembled violently around the rifle, 1 round remaining an impossible choice ahead of her, when suddenly from a position Emily hadn't even realized was occupied, a fresh burst of gunfire tore into the advancing fighters. Daniel Hayes, barely conscious, barely able to lift his own head, had somehow managed to pull a sidearm from his holster and was firing with what little strength remained in his battered body, buying precious seconds that turned the tide of that final desperate push. Hayes, what are you doing? Cole screamed, trying to pull the weapon from his patient's weakened grip, even as Daniel continued firing. You need to stay still. You're going to reopen that wound, not going to just lie here. Daniel gasped out, his voice barely above a whisper, and watch everyone die around me. Between Daniel's desperate weakened fire and Emily's final round, the assault on Alvarez's position, finally broke the remaining enemy fighters, pulling back under a combined defense that shouldn't have worked, that by every reasonable measure should have failed completely, but somehow impossibly held. For a moment, an eerie silence settled over the mountainside, broken only by ragged breathing and the distant crackle of a burning helicopter. "Status check," Jake shouted, voice hoarse. "Everyone sound off." One by one, voices called back, shaky but alive. Alvarez, Brooks, Cole. Even Daniel, weaker than the others, but unmistakably present. Emily's voice, when it finally came, cracked with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. "I'm out," she said quietly. "I'm completely out of ammunition." Jake looked over at her, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The weight of everything that had happened in the last 40 minutes settling between them like something too large to fully comprehend. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, Jake said finally into his radio, his voice steadier now, though something in it had changed permanently. "We have repelled a coordinated enemy assault, multiple hostiles down. We are still holding, but we are critically low on ammunition and have one severe casualty requiring immediate evacuation. I need that air support, and I need it now." There was a pause on the other end of the radio, longer than any of the previous responses, and when the voice finally came back, it carried a different tone entirely. "Ghost 1-6, be advised, air support has been reprioritized to your position. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes. After everything, after hours of impossible fighting, after a logistics specialist had transformed into the reason an entire SEAL team was still breathing, 15 minutes suddenly felt like nothing at all. Jake allowed himself a single shaky breath of relief before keying his radio again. "Copy that, command. 15 minutes. We'll hold." But even as those words left his mouth, movement on the ridgeline above them, faint but unmistakable, told him this fight was not quite finished yet. Because somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the reach of their remaining ammunition, the enemy commander was regrouping his forces for one final desperate push, and this time Emily Carter had nothing left to fire back with. 15 minutes had never felt so impossibly long. Emily stared down at the empty rifle in her hands, the weight of it suddenly feeling like nothing at all, like holding on to a memory rather than a weapon. Every round was gone. Every bullet she had used to buy this team 15 more minutes of life had been spent, and now as movement rippled along the ridgeline above them, she understood with a sick, hollow certainty that she had nothing left to give. "Jake," she called out, her voice tight. "I see movement. They're regrouping. I count at least 6, maybe more." Jake risked a glance over his cover jaw, tightening as he confirmed what she already knew. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, he said into his radio voice clipped with barely controlled urgency. "We are observing enemy forces regrouping for what appears to be a final assault. We are combat ineffective on ammunition for our sniper position. I need that air support to move faster." Ghost 1-6 air support is 15 minutes out. That is the fastest possible timeline. We cannot compress it further. "Then give me something," Jake snapped back. "Anything." There was a pause, and when the voice returned, it carried an edge of genuine sympathy that did nothing to soften the reality of their situation. "Copy Ghost 1-6. Hold position. Command is aware of your status." Jake lowered the radio slowly, and for the first time since the helicopter went down, Emily saw something in his face that looked dangerously close to hopelessness. 15 minutes, he muttered. 6 of us. How much ammunition does everyone have left? The answers came back one at a time, each one worse than the last. 2 mags, Alvarez called out. Maybe 60 rounds. 1.5, Brooks answered. I've been rationing since the RPG hit. I'm dry on my sidearm, Cole said, still hunched over Daniel, whose breathing had grown shallow and uneven despite the trauma kit Emily had risked her life to deliver. I need both hands on him, or he's not going to make 15 minutes, regardless of what happens with the enemy. Jake's eyes moved to Emily last. I'm empty, she said quietly, completely empty. For a moment, nobody spoke, the weight of their situation settling over the group like a physical thing. 60 rounds in change between 3 operators, a critically wounded man who might not survive the weight even without another attack, a logistics specialist who had just spent the last hour becoming the reason. Half of them were still breathing and now had nothing left to fire. Against an enemy force that by Emily's count still had 6 or more fighters converging for one final push. There has to be something, Emily said, mind racing, refusing to accept that everything she had just fought for could end here now, 15 minutes from rescue. The fighter I dropped near my position near the boulders, He had a weapon. Jake's head snapped toward her. What? The one who came around the rocks while I was getting the trauma kit, Emily said, already moving before she fully processed the decision. He's still there. His weapon should still be there too. Carter, that's exposed ground. Again, you almost died getting to that crate the first time. I know what it is. Emily's voice cracked with something raw and desperate. But we have 6 rounds between 4 of you and a man who might not live another 15 minutes. I am not going to sit here and do nothing while that math gets worse. Jake stared at her, and in that moment something passed between them that neither of them would ever fully put into words. Not permission exactly. Something closer to recognition. The understanding that the woman in front of him had already proven beyond any reasonable doubt that she was capable of decisions no one had trained her to make. Go, he said, fast, and Carter, She was already moving, but she paused for half a second, glancing back at him. Come back, he said simply. Emily didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice to hold steady if she tried. She moved low across the same brutal stretch of open ground she had crossed twice already that night, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Adrenaline, the only thing keeping her legs moving at all. The enemy fighter she had dropped lay exactly where he had fallen, and Emily forced herself not to look too closely at his face as she knelt beside him, hands shaking as she pried his rifle free and checked the magazine. Half full, maybe 15 rounds. It wasn't much, but it was something. She grabbed a second magazine from a pouch on his vest, forcing her mind to stay clinical, forcing herself not to think too hard about what she was doing or why her hands wouldn't stop trembling, and began the crawl back toward the group. She was 10 feet from cover when the first shot cracked past her head. Contact, Brooke screamed. They're pushing early, they're pushing now. Emily threw herself the remaining distance, hitting the ground hard behind a jagged outcropping, just as a fresh volley of gunfire tore into the space she had occupied a half second before. She lay there for a moment, chest heaving, the enemy rifle clutched against her like a lifeline before forcing herself back up onto her knees. I've got a weapon, she shouted. 15 rounds, maybe more in a second mag. Get it to Cole, Jake ordered. He needs to be able to defend Hayes if this gets close. Emily didn't argue. She scrambled toward Ryan Cole's position, sliding the rifle and spare magazine across the last few feet of open ground between them. Where did you? Cole started staring at the enemy weapon in disbelief. Don't ask, just use it if you need to, Emily said, already turning to check on Jake's position. How's he doing? Cole's face answered before his words did. Not good. His pressure's dropping again. I don't know if he makes 15 minutes, Emily. I really don't know. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She looked down at Daniel Hayes, pale and unconscious, the man whose fallen rifle had started this entire impossible chain of events, and felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the simple human refusal to let another person die if there was anything at all she could do about it. He makes it, she said with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. He has to. Above them, the enemy assault was building towards something final. Jake could see it in the way the remaining fighters were positioning themselves, no longer probing for weaknesses, but preparing for one committed all-or-nothing push that would either break the American defense completely or exhaust the last of their own forces trying. Command, this is Ghost 1-6, Jake said, voice tight. Enemy forces initiating what appears to be a final coordinated assault. We are critically low on ammunition. If air support does not arrive in the next 10 minutes, I cannot guarantee this position holds. Copy Ghost 1-6. Air support confirmed inbound ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Jake closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to steady himself, and then looked at his team. Alvarez 60 rounds and a face carved from grim determination. Brooks low on ammunition but still in position. Cole armed now with an enemy rifle he'd never trained and one hand still pressed against Daniel's chest. And Emily Carter, unarmed, exhausted, having already given more to this fight than anyone had any right to ask of her. We hold 12 minutes, Jake said loud enough for everyone to hear. 12 minutes and then we go home, all of us. The assault came like a wave. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions at once, enemy fighters advancing, with a desperation that told Jake everything he needed to know about how much this final push meant to whoever was commanding them. This was not a probing attack. This was everything they had left thrown at once, betting that overwhelming force would break the American position before reinforcements could arrive. They're flanking left, Alvarez shouted, firing in controlled bursts that ate through his remaining ammunition faster than any of them wanted to think about. Jake, I've got maybe 20 rounds left. Fall back toward Cole's position, Jake ordered. Consolidate, we hold together, or we don't hold at all. The teams scrambled to tighten their defensive perimeter. Alvarez and Brooks pulling back under covering fire from each other, forming a tighter circle around Cole and Daniel that left almost no margin for error. Emily found herself in the middle of it, unarmed, watching enemy fighters advance close enough now that she could see individual muzzle flashes instead of distant shapes on a ridgeline. Emily, get behind me, Cole shouted, shifting his position slightly to shield both Daniel and her as best he could with a single body. I can help, Emily said, desperation cutting through her voice. There has to be something I can do. You already did everything you could, Cole snapping back, not unkindly, but with the raw urgency of a man watching the walls close in. Now stay down and stay alive. That's the job right now. Emily hated every second of it, crouched behind cover with nothing to offer but her own presence, watching people she had risked her life for fighting a battle she no longer had the tools to help win. It felt like being back in that supply room, watching from behind glass, while everyone else determined the outcome. Then Alvarez went down. It happened fast, a single enemy round, finding a gap in his cover as he shifted position to get a better angle, and he collapsed with a sharp cry that cut through the chaos like a knife. Alvarez is hit, Brooks screamed. Mike, talk to me, Mike. I'm hit. Alvarez gasped, one hand clamped over his shoulder, blood already seeping between his fingers. I'm okay, I can still fight. Get back to your position. But Brooks was already moving toward him, torn between covering the advancing enemy fighters and reaching his wounded teammate. And in that half second of divided attention, an enemy fighter broke through the gap in their defense close enough now that Jake could see the whites of his eyes. Everything happened at once. Jake fired, catching the fighter mid-stride, but two more were right behind him, close enough that the fight had suddenly compressed from a battle across a mountainside into something desperate and immediate close-quarters chaos, where every decision had to happen in a fraction of a second. Cole raised the enemy rifle Emily had brought, him hands unsteady with a weapon he had never trained on, and fired blindly toward the advancing shapes. One dropped. The other kept coming, close enough now that Emily could see he was reaching for something at his belt, a blade instead of a weapon, close quarters and desperate. Cole! Emily screamed. There was no time to think. Emily grabbed a rock, the only thing within reach, and threw herself forward, putting her body between the advancing fighter and Daniel Hayes' unconscious form, with an instinct that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with a refusal to let this end. Here, not after everything, not after coming this far. The fighter's attention shifted to her for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Cole to bring the rifle around and fire a final round that ended the threat entirely. Emily collapsed backward, gasping adrenaline and terror mixing into something that made her whole body shake uncontrollably. Are you hit? Cole demanded, scanning her frantically for injury. No, Emily managed. No, I'm not hit. I'm okay. That was insane, Cole said, voice shaking with his own adrenaline. You just threw yourself at an armed man with a rock, Emily. It worked, she said, and somewhere underneath the terror, something close to disbelieving laughter bubbled up in her chest. Status? Jake's voice cut through the moment sharp with command urgency. Everyone sound off now. Alvarez is hit but stable conscious. Brooks called back, having reached his teammate and pressed a hand hard against the wound. He needs evac same as Hayes. Cole and Carter status. We're okay, Cole shouted back. Hayes is critical, but we held them off. We're okay. Jake allowed himself a single breath, checking his own ammunition, with hands that had gone steadier, now the way they always did when the moment demanded it, rather than allowed for fear. Command, this is Ghost 1-6, he said into the radio. We have taken another casualty. Repeat. Second casualty, we need that air support now. I don't care how you make it happen. We need it now. Ghost 1-6 air support is 5 minutes out. I say again, 5 minutes. 5 minutes. After everything, after hours of impossible fighting, after a woman who had never fired a weapon in combat, had somehow become the reason half this team was still breathing, 5 minutes felt like both an eternity and nothing at all. 5 minutes, Jake said loud enough for everyone to hear. We hold 5 more minutes, that's it, that's all we need. But the enemy commander, watching his forces dwindle with every passing minute, understood something Jake didn't yet know. He understood that this was his last chance, his final window before American air power arrived and turned this entire engagement into something no ground force could survive. And so, with the last of his reserves, he made one final desperate push, throwing everything he had left at the American position in a bid to end this before help could arrive. Gunfire erupted from every direction, at once more intense than anything that had come before it, enemy fighters no longer advancing with caution, but with the reckless desperation of men who understood this was their only remaining chance. "They're throwing everything at us," Brooks screamed, still pressed against Alvarez, trying to defend them both with dwindling ammunition. "Jake, I don't know if we hold this." Jake fired his last magazine in controlled, desperate bursts, watching enemy fighters fall and others take their place, the mathematics of the battle narrowing down to something brutally simple: ammunition versus time. Whichever ran out first would decide who survived this night. "Cole, how much do you have left?" Jake shouted. "3 rounds," Cole called back, voice tight with barely controlled panic. 3 rounds, and that's everything." Emily, still unarmed, watched the battle tighten around them with a growing, desperate horror. She had given everything she had to give, every round, every ounce of skill Parker had spent nearly a year building inside her. And now, in the final moments, she had nothing left except her own body to put between danger and the people she had fought so hard to protect. Then she saw it. A fallen weapon close enough to reach, dropped by one of the fighters Cole had eliminated during the earlier assault. She scrambled toward it without hesitation, checking the magazine, with hands that had somehow found a strange, terrible steadiness, despite everything her body had already endured that night. Full magazine, 30 rounds. She raised the weapon, unfamiliar in her hands but functional enough, and settled back into the rhythm Parker had drilled into her across nearly a year of nights nobody else had understood the value of. "Carter's got a weapon," Jake called out, relief cutting through the exhaustion in his voice. "Cover the east side. Carter, cover the east." Emily obeyed without hesitation, opening fire on advancing shapes with a precision that, despite the unfamiliar rifle, still carried the unmistakable steadiness Parker had spent so long teaching her. Enemy fighters fell. Others hesitated suddenly, uncertain of an advance that kept costing them men faster than they could replace them. And then, cutting through the chaos of gunfire and screaming and the desperate, grinding fight for survival, a new sound arrived. A deep, rhythmic thundering that grew louder with every passing second, a sound every single soldier on that mountainside recognized instantly, a sound that meant something had finally and possibly gone right. "That's air support," Brooks screamed, disbelief and relief tangled together in his voice. "Jake, that's air support. I hear rotors." Jake keyed his radio with hands that were shaking now for an entirely different reason. "Command, this is Ghost 1-6, and I have eyes on incoming air support. Please confirm." "Ghost 1-6 confirmed gunship, inbound ETA 90 seconds, mark your position with smoke." "Copy that. Brooks, pop smoke now." Brooks fumbled for the smoke canister on his vest and threw it into the open ground between their position and the advancing enemy fighters, a plume of colored smoke rising into the darkness like a signal flare of pure desperate hope. 90 seconds had never felt so long, and yet somehow impossibly, it also felt like nothing at all. The enemy fighters, sensing the shift in momentum, sensing that whatever was coming would end this fight decisively against them, pushed harder, faster, more desperately than at any point in the entire 3-hour battle. "They're not stopping," Cole shouted, firing his last round and reaching desperately for a fallen weapon nearby. "Jake, they're not falling back." "Hold," Jake roared. "Hold 30 more seconds. That's all we need." Emily fired her last several rounds with a focus that blocked out everything except the rhythm Parker had built into her breathe, find the pause fire, breathe, find the pause fire, until finally the sound of rotors overhead became impossible to ignore, a shadow passing across the moon that every soldier on that mountainside recognized as salvation. The gunship's weapons opened up seconds later, a devastating, precise barrage that tore through the remaining enemy positions with a finality that ended the battle in a way 3 hours of desperate ground fighting never could have. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Silence settled across the mountainside, broken only by the receding thunder of rotors, the ragged breathing of exhausted soldiers, and somewhere in the distance, the first hints of dawn beginning to touch the eastern sky. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The reality of survival took a moment to fully settle over people who had spent the last 3 hours believing on some level that they might not live to see this exact silence. Then Jake's voice broke through it, hoarse and shaking, with something that was equal parts exhaustion and disbelief. "Status check. Everyone sound off. Now!" The voices came back one by one, each one a small miracle in its own right. Brooks exhausted but unhurt. Alvarez wounded but stable, his voice tight with pain but unmistakably alive. Cole drained but steady, still keeping pressure on Daniel Hayes' wound with hands that had refused to stop working for the last 3 hours straight. "And Emily, I'm here," she said quietly, lowering the unfamiliar rifle from her shoulder, staring at her own trembling hands as if she didn't quite recognize them anymore. "I'm here." Jake made his way toward her, slowly picking through the aftermath of a battlefield that bore no resemblance to the routine extraction mission this had started as. When he reached her, he simply stood there for a moment, studying her face in the pale light of approaching dawn, and Emily found herself unable to read the expression settling across his features. "You saved this team," he said finally, his voice rough. "Every single one of us. Do you understand that?" Emily shook her head slowly, not in denial, but in something closer to overwhelmed disbelief. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's not what most people do," Jake said. "Most people freeze. Most people can't. You're logistics, Carter. You've never seen combat in your life before tonight, and you just held this position when trained operators were running out of options." "I had help," Emily said quietly, thinking of Parker, of 100 nights on a firing range. Nobody else had understood the value of a man who had seen something in her that she had never seen in herself. "I had a lot of help." The gunship that had saved them circled back and hovered nearby, preparing to bring in a proper medical evacuation team, and within minutes the mountainside that had been a battlefield only moments before began transforming into something that looked almost like an ordinary rescue operation. Medics rushed to stabilize Daniel Hayes and Mike Alvarez. Soldiers began the grim, methodical work of securing the area. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a logistics specialist, who had never expected to matter beyond a supply manifest, stood quietly watching the sun begin to rise over a valley that had very nearly become her grave. Daniel Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked over him, but in a brief moment of clarity, his eyes found Emily standing nearby. "Carter," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Emily moved closer, immediately kneeling beside the stretcher. "I'm here. Don't try to talk. Save your strength." "My rifle." He managed a faint, exhausted attempt at a smile crossing his pale face. "You give it back when you're done with it." Emily felt something crack open in her chest, somewhere between laughter and tears, and found herself unable to hold back either one completely. "Whenever you want it," she said. "It's yours." "Keep it a while longer," Daniel whispered, his eyes drifting closed again as the medics prepared him for evacuation. "Seems like you know what to do with it." As the first medical helicopter lifted off carrying Daniel Hayes and Mike Alvarez toward the emergency care that would determine whether they survived what had happened here, Emily Carter stood alone for a moment amid the wreckage of a helicopter, the scattered evidence of a battle that had changed something fundamental inside her, and felt the full weight of exhaustion finally catch up to a body that had been running on pure adrenaline for hours. Jake found her there, staring out at the valley at the pale light of dawn, breaking over rocks stained with the evidence of everything that had happened that night. "You did good, Carter," he said quietly, settling beside her. "Better than good. I don't think any of us are ever going to forget what you did here tonight." Emily nodded slowly, but she couldn't quite bring herself to feel the pride Jake's words seemed to expect from her. Instead, something heavier had settled into her chest, something she didn't yet have the words to fully explain. "How many?" she started, then stopped, unable to finish the question. Jake understood anyway. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher over the ridgeline, where hours before enemy fighters had been closing in on a team that should not have survived this night. "You saved 5 American lives tonight," he said finally. "That's what matters. That's what you carry forward from this." But as the second evacuation helicopter arrived to carry the rest of the team off that mountainside, and Emily Carter climbed aboard, still clutching a rifle that wasn't hers, staring back at a battlefield that would haunt her dreams for years to come, she understood that Jake's math, while accurate, didn't come close to capturing the full weight of what she was carrying home with her. She had saved 5 lives, but she had also taken others at a distance and up close in ways that no amount of training could have fully prepared her for. And as the helicopter lifted off into a sky finally clear of gunfire and explosions, Emily Carter closed her eyes and understood with a clarity that felt almost unbearable that surviving this night was only the beginning of a much longer battle. The base felt different when Emily stepped off that helicopter, though nothing about it had physically changed. Same buildings, same faces moving across the tarmac in the pale gray light of early morning. But something in her had shifted so completely during those 3 hours on that mountainside that the familiar world around her now felt like it belonged to someone else, someone she used to be. Carter. She turned to find Jake Morrison standing a few feet away, his uniform torn and bloodstained, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and yet he was looking at her with an expression she had never once seen directed at her in her entire military career. Respect. "You should get checked out," he said. "Medical, I mean. You went through a lot out there." "I'm fine," Emily said automatically, the same reflexive deflection she had used her whole life whenever anyone paid her too much attention. "That's not a request," Jake said, though his voice carried no harshness in it. "Everyone who was on that mountainside gets checked out. That includes you." Emily didn't have the energy to argue. She let herself be led toward the medical tent, and it was there sitting on the edge of an examination table while a nurse checked her vitals that the adrenaline finally completely abandoned her. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not the fine, controllable tremor she had fought through on the mountainside, but something deeper. Something that seemed to come from somewhere she couldn't reach or control. The nurse noticed immediately, exchanging a glance with another medical staff member that Emily caught but pretended not to. "Miss Carter, I'm going to have someone from behavioral health come talk to you," the nurse said gently. "That's standard procedure after direct combat exposure. Nothing to worry about." Direct combat exposure. The words felt strange, applied to her like they belonged to someone else's file, someone else's life. Emily nodded numbly, staring down at her own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Word travels fast on a military base, faster than official reports, faster than any command briefing could ever move. By the time Emily made it back to her barracks that morning, stories were already spreading in hushed, disbelieving tones through every corner of the installation. The logistics girl picked up a sniper rifle. The logistics girl saved an entire SEAL team. Some soldiers looked at her with open awe when she passed. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the quiet, unremarkable supply specialist they thought they knew with the woman now being discussed in every mess hall conversation on base. Emily found all of it unbearable in ways she hadn't expected. She didn't want to be looked at. She didn't want to be a story. She wanted desperately to disappear into her bunk and sleep for 100 years to wake up and discover that none of it had actually happened, that Daniel Hayes had never fallen, that she had never crawled across that open ground, that the face of the man she had killed at close range had never existed at all. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief. She woke, gasping in the middle of the afternoon, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, if she were still crouched behind those boulders, still hearing Jake's desperate voice shouting for a rifle nobody else could reach. The dream had been so vivid, so exact in every terrible detail, that for several disorienting seconds, she genuinely didn't know where she was. She sat up breathing hard and found herself crying before she even understood why. It wasn't relief. It wasn't pride. It was something heavier. Something that felt like grief mixed with terror, mixed with an exhaustion so complete it seemed to reach into her bones. There was a knock at her door sometime later, and when Emily opened it, wiping her face quickly, hoping the evidence of her tears wasn't too obvious, she found Master Sergeant William Parker standing there, his expression unreadable in the way it so often was. "I heard," he said simply. Emily stepped back to let him in, unable to find words for a long moment. Parker didn't push. He simply waited the way he always had during their training sessions, patient, in a manner that had taught Emily more about discipline than any lecture ever could have. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she finally admitted, sitting down heavily on the edge of her bunk. "Everyone keeps telling me I'm a hero. Jake told me I saved 5 lives. And I know that's true, I know it happened, but Sergeant, I keep seeing his face." "Whose face?" "The man I shot up close. Not from the ridge, not through a scope from 200 meters, where it felt almost like something on a screen. The one who came around the rocks while I was getting supplies for coal. I was close enough to see his eyes before I pulled the trigger, and now I can't stop seeing them." Parker sat down across from her, his expression grave but not unkind. "How many people have you told this to? Just you?" "Good," he said. "Keep telling someone. That's the mistake most soldiers make, Carter." They think carrying it alone makes them strong. It doesn't. It just makes them alone. Does it ever go away? Emily asked, her voice small in a way that felt foreign, coming from her own mouth. The face, I mean. Does it ever stop being the first thing I see when I close my eyes? Parker was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, there was a weight in his voice that told Emily he was speaking from someplace deep and personal, someplace he didn't often let people see. No, he said honestly. It doesn't go away, not completely, but it changes. It stops being the only thing you see. Right now, it feels like it's everything, like it's swallowed up every other part of who you are. Give it time, and it becomes part of the whole picture instead of the entire picture. That's not very comforting, Sergeant. I'm not in the business of comforting lies, Parker said. I told you once that the fact you question yourself means you still have your humanity. I meant that. The soldiers who come back from something like this and feel nothing, who don't lose a single night of sleep over what they had to do, those are the ones who worry me. You feeling this as brutal as it is right now, that's not weakness, Carter. That's proof of exactly who you are. Emily wiped at her eyes again, frustrated with herself for the tears she couldn't seem to control. I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I'm falling apart. Heroes fall apart, Parker said. Then they figure out how to put themselves back together. That's the part nobody puts in the stories. They sat together in silence for a while after that, and something about Parker's presence, steady and unwavering, the way it had been throughout every difficult training session over the past year, helped Emily's breathing slow, helped the tremor in her hands finally begin to still. Daniel Hayes, she said eventually. Do you know if there's been any update? He's stable, Parker said. I made it through surgery. They're saying he'll recover fully given time. Alvarez too. Both of them are going to be okay, Carter, because of what you did out there. Something in Emily's chest loosened slightly at that news, the first genuine relief she had felt since stepping off that helicopter. I need to see him, she said. When he's able to have visitors, I need to see him. I think he'd like that. 3 days later, Emily found herself standing outside a hospital room, hesitating with her hand raised to knock, uncertain suddenly of what she would even say to the man whose fallen rifle had changed the entire course of her life in a single night. She had rehearsed a dozen different openings in her head on the walk over, and every single one of them felt wrong now that she was actually standing at his door. You planning on coming in, or just going to stand out there all day? Daniel's voice, weak but unmistakably amused, carried through the partially open door. Emily felt a nervous laugh escape her as she pushed it open and stepped inside. He looked better than she expected, propped up against a hospital bed. Color returned to his face, though bandages and the careful, guarded way he held himself told the story of just how close he had come to not being here at all. You look like you've been through a war, Emily said, immediately wincing at how ridiculous the comment sounded given the circumstances. Daniel laughed, a real warm sound that eased something in her chest she hadn't realized was still tense. Yeah, something like that. How are you feeling? Like someone shot me and then a logistics specialist stole my rifle and turned it into the reason I'm still alive, he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. So mixed emotions. Emily felt heat rush to her face. I didn't steal it. I'm messing with you, Carter, Daniel said gently. Sit down, please. She lowered herself into the chair beside his bed, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The weight of everything that had happened, settling comfortably enough between two people who had shared something few others could ever fully understand. I heard what you did, Daniel said, finally his voice losing its playful edge. All of it. Cole told me. The supplies you ran through open fire to get to him. The RPG position. The final push. He said you were out of ammunition and still went back out for more. I did what needed to be done. That's what everyone keeps saying you say, Daniel replied, studying her carefully. But I want to hear it from you. Why your logistics, Carter? Nobody would have blamed you for staying down. Nobody would have expected you to do any of what you did. Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her own hands, the same hands that had trembled uncontrollably as she held his rifle for the first time under fire. I watched your rifle fall, she said finally. And in that moment, I understood that if nobody picked it up, everyone might die. And I realized I was the only one who could reach it. Everyone else was already fighting their own battle. I wasn't fighting anything. I was just there. You were trained, Daniel said. Off the books with Parker, right? Cole mentioned something. For almost a year, Emily admitted. Nobody knew, really. I didn't even fully believe it myself that any of it would ever matter. I thought I was just doing something that made me feel less invisible. Well, Daniel said, it turns out invisible people save lives too. Mine specifically. Emily managed a small, genuine smile at that, though it faded quickly as heavier thoughts crowded back in. I keep thinking about the ones I didn't save, she said quietly. The ones I... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Daniel understood exactly what she meant. I've been where you are, he said, his voice gentler now. Not this exact moment, but close enough. First time I took a life in combat, I didn't sleep for 4 days straight. Kept seeing his face every time I closed my eyes. Felt like I was drowning in it. How did you get past it? I'm not sure you ever fully get past it, Daniel admitted. But you learn to carry it differently. You remember that every life you took a shot at was also protecting lives you couldn't afford to lose. Both things are true at the same time, and you have to learn to hold both without letting either one crush you. Emily nodded slowly, though the weight in her chest didn't lift entirely. Thank you, she said, for telling me that, for not pretending it's simple. It's not simple, Daniel agreed, but you're not alone in it either. That's the part that matters most. They talked for a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory, and by the time Emily finally left his hospital room, something in her had settled just slightly, not healed, not fixed, but steadied, in a way that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The days that followed brought a strange new reality Emily had never anticipated having to navigate. She was summoned to a formal debriefing, seated across from senior officers who listened to her account of that night, with expressions ranging from disbelief to open admiration. She answered every question carefully, precisely the same methodical attention to detail that had once made her exceptional at counting ammunition, now applied to recounting the worst and most extraordinary night of her life. Specialist Carter, one of the officers, said toward the end of the debriefing, an older man with graying hair and a chest full of ribbons that spoke to decades of service, "What you did out there falls well outside the scope of your assigned role." "I understand that, sir." "I don't think you do," he said, though not unkindly. "What you did wasn't just brave. It was frankly exceptional. The kind of performance under fire that most operators spend years training to achieve, and some never do. We don't typically see that level of composure and precision from someone with no combat sniper training." "I had training, sir," Emily said carefully. "Unofficial but real. Master Sergeant Parker." "We're aware of Sergeant Parker's involvement," the officer said, and something in his tone made Emily's stomach tighten with sudden worry that she had somehow gotten Parker in trouble for training her outside official channels. "That's actually part of what we want to discuss with you." Emily's mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. "Sir, if there's an issue with the training being unofficial, that's entirely on me. I sought him out. He was simply..." "Specialist Carter," the officer interrupted gently. "Nobody is in trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. We want to talk to you about a formal offer." Emily blinked, caught completely off guard. "Sir, advanced sniper training, a full transfer out of logistics into a combat role contingent on completing the program successfully. Given what you demonstrated on that mountainside and given the unofficial foundation Sergeant Parker already built, we believe you have the raw ability to become an exceptional asset in a formal capacity." The room seemed to tilt slightly around Emily, the weight of the offer settling over her with a force she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know what to say," she admitted honestly. "You don't need to answer right now," the officer said. "Take some time. This is a significant decision, and we want you to make it with a clear head, not in the immediate aftermath of what you went through. But know that the offer stands, and know that very few people in this man's army ever demonstrate what you demonstrated 3 nights ago." Emily left that meeting in a daze, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider before. A safe, predictable future in logistics. The career path she had built her entire identity around for years. Under something else entirely. Something that meant embracing the part of herself that had emerged on that mountainside, the part capable of precision and courage under fire that even she hadn't fully believed existed until she had no choice but to find out. She found Parker later that evening, sitting alone at the range, the same range where he had first discovered her hidden talent nearly a year earlier. "They made me an offer," she said without preamble, sitting down beside him. "I heard..." Parker said, not looking surprised in the slightest. Advanced sniper training, full transfer. You knew, though? I recommended it, Parker admitted. After what you did out there, it would have been a waste not to. But the decision is entirely yours, Carter. I want to be clear about that. Nobody is going to think less of you if you choose to stay in logistics. Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening range where she had spent nearly a year of nights. Nobody else knew about discovering a version of herself she had never expected to exist. I'm scared, she admitted finally. Not of the training, of what it means to accept this. It means admitting that this is who I am now. The person who takes lives when the moment demands it. I'm not sure I'm ready to fully become that. Parker considered her words carefully before responding. Your talent is not a gift for yourself, he said finally. It's a responsibility to the people who need you. That's not me telling you what to choose, Carter. That's me reminding you what's actually at stake in the decision. What if I fail? What if the next time I freeze? What if that night was some kind of fluke, adrenaline and desperation, and it turns out I can't actually do this when it's not a matter of pure survival? You won't know unless you try, Parker said simply. But I'll tell you this, I've trained dozens of soldiers over the years. I've seen natural talent plenty of times. What I saw in you was different. It wasn't just talent. It was the willingness to act despite fear to put yourself in danger for people who weren't even yours to protect. That's not something that shows up by accident, Carter. That's who you are underneath everything else. Emily sat with those words for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky over the range, feeling the weight of a decision that would determine the entire shape of the rest of her life. I don't want to return to logistics, she said finally, the realization arriving slowly like something she had known all along, but had been too afraid to admit. I thought I did. I thought that would be the safe choice, the comfortable choice. But sitting here thinking about going back to counting ammunition after everything that happened, it feels like going backward, like pretending something didn't happen. That's not a small realization, Parker said quietly. I know, Emily said, and it terrifies me. Good, Parker said. It should. The things worth doing usually do. The formal transfer paperwork took several weeks to process, weeks Emily spent in a strange, suspended state between the life she had known and the one she was choosing to step into. She visited Daniel Hayes regularly as he continued his recovery, their conversations gradually shifting from the trauma of that night toward easier, more ordinary territory, and unexpected friendship forming between two people whose lives had collided in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. You're really doing it, Daniel said during one of her visits, watching her carefully as she sat in the now familiar chair beside his hospital bed. Sniper training. I'm really doing it, Emily confirmed, though her voice carried a mixture of determination and lingering uncertainty. You know it's not going to be easy, right? Advanced training is brutal. They're going to push you harder than Parker ever did, and that's saying something. I know. And there's no guarantee you make it through. Some of the best natural shooters in this army wash out of that program. It's not just about skill. It's about everything else, the mental discipline, the ability to hold together under conditions specifically designed to break you. Daniel, Emily said, a small smile crossing her face despite the seriousness of the conversation. Are you trying to talk me out of this? No, he said, returning the smile, though something more sincere lingered beneath it. I'm trying to make sure you go into it with your eyes open, because I've seen what you're capable of, Carter. I watched it happen with my own eyes, even half unconscious and bleeding out on a mountainside. What you did that night wasn't luck. But knowing what you can do and formalizing it into a career that's different, that's harder in some ways than the moment itself. Emily considered his words carefully. Why harder? Because in the moment you didn't have time to doubt yourself, Daniel said. Instinct and training took over before fear could stop you. But training, real training, gives you plenty of time to doubt, plenty of time to wonder if you're really capable of what everyone now believes you are. That's its own kind of battle. I appreciate the honesty, Emily said, even if it's not exactly reassuring. I'm not in the business of comforting lies, Daniel said, and Emily let out a surprised laugh at hearing Parker's exact words echoed back to her from someone who had never even spoken to him about that conversation. What's funny? Daniel asked, genuinely confused by her reaction. Nothing, Emily said, still smiling. Just something Parker said to me. Guess it's a universal truth among people who've actually been through this. The day Emily reported for advanced sniper training arrived with a mixture of terror and something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember like genuine purpose. She stood at the edge of a training facility, unlike anything she had experienced during her time in logistics, surrounded by soldiers who had years of combat experience she couldn't begin to match, and felt the familiar crushing weight of self-doubt threatening to overwhelm her before the training had even properly begun. "You look like you're about to run," a voice said beside her. Emily turned to find a woman roughly her own age standing nearby, her expression sharp and assessing in a way that immediately reminded Emily of every intimidating soldier she had ever encountered. "I'm considering it," Emily admitted honestly. The woman laughed, though not unkindly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, heard about what happened on that extraction mission. Word travels fast around here." "Specialist Carter," Emily said, extending her hand. "Former logistics." "Former," Rodriguez repeated, shaking her hand firmly. "I like that. Most people who wash into this program come from combat backgrounds already. You came from a supply room and apparently still managed to save an entire SEAL team. That takes guts most operators I've met don't have." "Or it takes desperation," Emily said. "There's a difference." "Maybe," Rodriguez said, studying her carefully, "or maybe desperation just reveals what was already there. Either way, welcome to the hardest thing you'll ever do." The first weeks of formal training tested Emily in ways that made her unofficial sessions with Parker feel almost gentle by comparison. Instructors pushed her physically to points of exhaustion she hadn't known existed, forced her through mental endurance exercises designed specifically to simulate the psychological pressure of real combat, and repeatedly placed her in scenarios engineered to expose every weakness she carried, every doubt, every hesitation that might prove fatal in an actual mission. She failed constantly. There were nights she lay awake in her bunk, questioning whether the officer's confidence in her had been misplaced, whether the miracle of that mountainside had truly been a fluke, born of pure desperation rather than any real sustainable talent. "You're overthinking the win calculation again," her instructor, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Torres, told her during one particularly frustrating session. "I watched you nail 3 shots in a row a week ago under stress conditions that should have broken your concentration completely. Now you're second-guessing basic math you've done 100 times. What's different?" "I don't know," Emily admitted, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Maybe it was different because it was real. Maybe I only perform when there's actually something at stake." Torres considered this for a long moment. "That's a common problem, actually. Some people train beautifully and fall apart under real pressure. You're the opposite. You perform under pressure and struggle in controlled settings. That's rare, Carter, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it means we need to figure out how to bridge that gap, because you won't always have life or death stakes to sharpen your focus." "How do we do that?" "We simulate it as closely as we can," Torres said, "and we work on your mental discipline outside of crisis conditions. Because the truth is, Carter, most of what makes an exceptional sniper isn't the shot itself. It's everything that happens in the mind before, during, and after that shot. That's the real training." Weeks turned into months, each one bringing new challenges that pushed Emily to the edges of what she believed herself capable of enduring. There were moments of genuine doubt so consuming she considered walking away entirely, moments where the memory of that mountainside felt less like a source of strength and more like a wound that training kept reopening in new and unexpected ways. But there were also breakthroughs, small at first, then increasingly significant moments where the discipline Parker had first cultivated in her began to fully integrate with the formal skills her instructors were building on top of that foundation. "You've changed," Rodriguez observed one evening, several months into their shared training as the two women sat together after a particularly grueling exercise. "From that first day, I mean. You don't flinch anymore when Torres pushes you." "I still flinch," Emily said. "I've just gotten better at hiding it." "That's most of what this job actually is," Rodriguez said. "Managing what other people see while managing what's actually happening inside you. You're getting good at both." Emily thought about Parker's words often during those difficult months, the reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She thought about Daniel Hayes recovering steadily and eventually returning to active duty himself, sending her occasional messages of encouragement that arrived exactly when she needed them most. And she thought often about her parents back in Montana, about the sacrifice and quiet endurance that had shaped her long before any rifle ever entered her life. She called home more often during those months than she had in years, finding herself needing the grounding presence of her parents' voices in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You sound different," her mother observed during one call several months into her training. "Tired but different. Good different, I think." "I feel different," Emily admitted. "I don't know how to explain it exactly. Like I finally found something I was supposed to be doing all along, even though it terrifies me every single day." "Your father was the same way after his accident," Susan Carter said quietly. "Finding purpose again after everything changed. It doesn't erase the fear, Emily. It just gives you a reason to keep moving through it." "I miss you both," Emily said, emotion catching in her throat unexpectedly. "We miss you too," her mother said. "And Emily, we've always been proud of you. Even when you were the girl who kept meticulous ammunition records nobody else appreciated. But I won't pretend I'm not amazed by who you're becoming now." The conversation stayed with Emily long after the call ended, a reminder of everything and everyone she was fighting to become worthy of every sacrifice that had shaped her long before she ever understood what she was capable of achieving. As her training progressed toward its final, most demanding phase, Emily found herself increasingly aware that the woman who had crawled toward Daniel Hayes's fallen rifle on that mountainside months earlier bore only a passing resemblance to who she was becoming now. The fear hadn't disappeared. The doubt hadn't fully quieted. But something steadier had grown underneath both of those things, something that felt for the first time in her entire life like a version of herself she genuinely recognized as whole. She had no way of knowing as she prepared for the final evaluation that would determine whether she completed the program successfully, that the hardest test of everything she had learned was still waiting for her, not on a training range, but in a moment that would once again ask her to choose between safety and sacrifice, between the comfortable predictability of a life fully earned and the harder, more uncertain path of becoming exactly who Parker had always believed she could be. The final evaluation arrived on a morning that felt too ordinary for something so consequential. Gray skies stretching over the training facility, the air carrying that particular stillness that always seemed to settle before something enormous was about to happen. Emily stood at the edge of the assembly area with 11 other candidates, all that remained of the 40 who had started this program with her, and felt her stomach twist into something that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with fear. 11, Rodriguez muttered beside her, scanning the group with the same tight expression Emily imagined was mirrored on her own face. "We started with 40, and it's down to 11. "Don't remind me," Emily said quietly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to remind you that you're already standing somewhere most people never make it to. Whatever happens today, that's already true." Sergeant Torres walked the line slowly, his expression giving away nothing, the way it never did before a critical exercise. He had spent months breaking Emily down and building her back up piece by piece until the woman who had once frozen over basic wind calculations could now execute complex multi-target scenarios with a composure that occasionally startled even him. "Today isn't about hitting targets," Torres said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled candidates. "You've all proven you can shoot. Today is about everything else. Decision-making under stress, composure when the scenario doesn't go the way you expect. And I promise you it will not go the way you expect." Emily's mind flashed unbidden to that mountainside, to Jake's desperate voice shouting for a rifle nobody else could reach, to the way every plan and expectation had shattered the moment that helicopter went down. She understood in a way most of the other candidates couldn't exactly what Torres meant. "Carter." Torres stopped in front of her, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. "You've had the most unusual path to this moment out of everyone standing here. I want you to remember something today. Whatever happens, you already proved what you are made of long before you ever set foot in this program. Don't let today make you forget that." "Yes, Sergeant." The evaluation began without further ceremony. Candidates dispatched one at a time into a sprawling, simulated environment designed to test every dimension of their training simultaneously. Emily waited her turn with a growing restless anxiety that reminded her uncomfortably of standing on that helicopter months earlier, watching the SEAL operators check their gear with practiced calm, while her own hands remained white-knuckled around a harness strap. When her name was finally called, she forced her breathing to slow, forced Parker's voice into her mind, the way she always did in moments that demanded steadiness she wasn't sure she possessed. Breathe, find the pause. The scenario unfolded with a complexity that immediately tested every instinct she had developed. A simulated hostage situation, multiple threats requiring rapid target discrimination, environmental factors, changing without warning, wind shifting, lighting conditions, deteriorating the entire exercise designed specifically to punish hesitation and reward the kind of decisive, disciplined action Torres had spent months trying to instill in her. She moved through the first phase with a precision that surprised even herself, identifying threats, discriminating between hostile and friendly targets with a speed that felt almost instinctive now, the product of hundreds of repetitions that had slowly rewired something fundamental in how her mind processed danger. Then the scenario shifted in a way nothing had prepared her for. A simulated radio call crackled through her earpiece, an unscripted voice that didn't match the training cadence she had grown used to over the past months. Something urgent and unfamiliar bleeding into the exercise in a way that made her chest tighten with sudden confusion. "Carter, this is not part of the scripted evaluation," the voice said, and something in its tone made every hair on Emily's body stand up. "We have a real situation developing. I need you to stay in position and stay sharp. This is not a drill." For a fraction of a second, Emily's mind refused to process what she was hearing, certain this had to be some elaborate twist within the evaluation itself, a test designed to see how she handled uncertainty about whether a scenario was real or simulated. Then she heard Torres's voice, no longer measured and instructional, but sharp with genuine alarm. "All candidates hold position. This is Torres. We have a security breach on the perimeter of the facility. I need everyone to remain exactly where they are until further instruction." Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. "Is this real?" she said into her radio, unable to keep the tension out of her voice. "Sergeant, is this part of the exercise?" The pause before Torres answered lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. "This is real, Carter. We have an unauthorized individual who breached the outer perimeter fence roughly 4 minutes ago, armed and moving toward the training facility. Local security is responding, but you and the other candidates are the closest trained personnel to the intrusion point." Emily's mind raced, adrenaline flooding through a body that had spent months training specifically for moments like this, and yet nothing about the sterile, controlled environment of the training facility had prepared her for the sudden, visceral reality that this wasn't a simulation anymore. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the sudden roar of her own pulse in her ears. "I need you to hold your position and maintain observation of the northern approach," Torres said. "Rodriguez is covering the eastern side. Do not engage unless the individual presents a direct threat to civilian or military personnel. Do you copy?" "Copy," Emily said, already shifting her position, scanning the tree line at the edge of the facility with an intensity that made her earlier training scenario feel almost quaint by comparison. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Emily lay motionless, scope trained on the tree line, her breathing controlled through sheer force of will, despite a heart rate that refused to slow down. She thought briefly and involuntarily of that mountainside of Daniel Hayes falling, of Jake's desperate shout, echoing across a valley that had changed the entire trajectory of her life. This isn't that, she told herself. This is different. Stay focused. Then movement. A figure emerged from the tree line roughly 200 meters from her position, moving with an erratic, unpredictable gait that immediately set off every warning instinct Torres had spent months drilling into her. Something about the way he moved, unsteady, agitated one arm, clutched tight against his body, in a manner that suggested either injury or concealment, told Emily this situation was far more volatile than a simple perimeter breach. "I have eyes on the individual," she reported, forcing her voice to remain level. "Northern tree line moving erratically, possible injury or concealed weapon cannot confirm from this distance." "Copy, maintain observation," Torres responded. "Local security is 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. Emily kept the figure in her scope, watching him stumble forward, with a desperation that seemed less like tactical aggression and more like something else entirely, something that made her stomach twist with a different kind of unease. "Sergeant," she said slowly, adjusting her focus, "I don't think this is a security threat. I think this individual may be in medical distress. He's not moving like someone conducting a hostile approach. He's moving like someone who's hurt." There was a pause on the other end of the radio. "Can you confirm that assessment?" Emily studied the figure more closely, noting the way he clutched his side, the unsteady weaving path he cut across the open ground, the complete absence of any tactical awareness that would suggest hostile intent. I can't confirm with full certainty from this distance, she said, but my assessment is medical emergency, not hostile intrusion, requesting permission to approach and provide assistance rather than treat this as a threat. Another pause longer this time, and Emily understood that Torres was weighing her judgment against protocols designed for exactly the kind of ambiguous high-stakes decision she was now asking him to trust her with. Rodriguez converge on Carter's position, Torres said finally. Carter, you have permission to approach with caution, but I want overwatch in place before you move. Do not compromise your own safety. Emily waited every second, stretching unbearably until Rodriguez's voice confirmed she had eyes on the position and was ready to provide cover. Only then did Emily rise from her position and begin moving cautiously toward the figure, her weapon lowered, but ready, every instinct from that mountainside months earlier, informing the careful, deliberate way she approached. As she drew closer, her assessment was confirmed with a clarity that sent relief and alarm crashing through her simultaneously. The man was not hostile. He was a local civilian, likely a hiker, who had wandered onto restricted land, and he was clutching a wound in his side that looked, even from a distance, dangerously serious. Sir, can you hear me? Emily called out, closing the remaining distance carefully. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay still. The man's eyes, glassy with pain and shock, focused on her with visible confusion. I fell, he managed, his voice weak. There was a fence I didn't realize I fell on, something I think I'm bleeding pretty bad. Emily reached him and immediately dropped to her knees, assessing the wound with hands that had steadied into the same clinical focus she had discovered on that mountainside months earlier. A deep laceration clearly caused by something sharp along the fence line, blood loss significant, but not immediately life-threatening if treated quickly. Rodriguez, I need a medical kit here now, Emily shouted into her radio. Civilian male laceration to the abdomen, moderate blood loss, conscious and responsive, but needs immediate treatment. On my way. Emily applied pressure to the wound with hands that had learned through the hardest possible teacher exactly how to remain steady when everything around her demanded panic instead. What's your name? She asked the man, keeping her voice calm and measured. Gary Bakter, he managed. I was just hiking. I didn't mean to end up here. I swear I just got turned around and there was this fence and Gary, you don't need to explain anything right now, Emily said gently. I need you to focus on breathing steady for me. Help is coming. You're going to be okay. Rodriguez arrived moments later with a full medical kit, and together the two women stabilized Gary's wound with a coordinated efficiency that spoke to months of training, now finding real immediate purpose outside the controlled boundaries of a simulated exercise. By the time local security arrived to secure the scene and medical personnel took over Gary's care, Emily found herself sitting back on her heels, adrenaline slowly draining from her system, staring at blood on her hands that belonged to a stranger she had never expected to encounter during what was supposed to be the final evaluation of her entire training program. Torres approached moments later, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. That wasn't part of any scenario I designed, he said quietly. I know, Sergeant. You made a judgment call that went against the initial threat assessment protocol, Torres continued. You could have engaged that individual as a hostile threat based on the information you had. Instead, you reassessed, gathered additional information, and made a decision that ultimately saved a civilian's life. Emily wasn't sure how to respond, uncertain whether she was about to be commended or reprimanded for deviating from standard protocol in a moment that had demanded exactly the kind of independent judgment nobody could have scripted in advance. Was that the wrong call? She asked finally. Torres studied her for a long moment before a small, genuine smile broke through his usually stern expression. That was exactly the right call, Carter. That's precision under pressure in its truest form. Anyone can hit a target on a range. What you just demonstrated, the ability to read a situation accurately under extreme stress and make the correct call, even when protocol might suggest otherwise, that's the entire point of everything we've been building toward these past months. Relief flooded through Emily so completely that her legs nearly gave out beneath her. So I passed. You more than passed, Torres said. You demonstrated exactly what this program exists to identify. Go get cleaned up, Carter. I think you've more than earned it. The formal graduation ceremony took place 3 weeks later. A modest affair by military standards, but one that carried a weight far beyond its simple logistics for the small group of soldiers who had survived the brutal months of training to reach this moment. Emily stood in her dress uniform, feeling strangely out of place in the formal setting after months spent almost exclusively in combat gear and training fatigues, and scanned the small crowd of attendees with a nervous energy she couldn't quite shake. Her parents had made the trip from Montana, her father moving carefully but steadily beside her mother, both of them wearing expressions of pride so plain and unguarded that Emily felt her throat tighten the moment she spotted them. "Look at you all," her mother said, pulling her into a tight embrace the moment the formal proceedings concluded. "Emily, look at you." "Mom, I'm still me," Emily said, though even she could hear how untrue that sounded, given everything that had changed since the last time her parents had seen her in person. Her father studied her for a long moment, his eyes carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent years learning what it meant to carry burdens most people never had to understand. "You're still you," he said finally. "But you're also so much more than the girl who left for basic training all those years ago. I've never been prouder of anything in my life, Emily, not even close." Emily felt tears threaten despite every effort to maintain her composure, and she let herself lean into her father's embrace the way she hadn't in years, feeling for just a moment like the same girl who used to sit at that kitchen table doing homework while her parents whispered about bills they thought she couldn't hear. "I have someone I want you to meet," Emily said, eventually wiping her eyes and scanning the crowd until she found Master Sergeant William Parker standing slightly apart from the main gathering, watching the proceedings with the same quiet, unassuming presence he always carried. She led her parents toward him, and something in Parker's expression shifted the moment introductions began, a warmth Emily rarely saw from him, breaking through his usually reserved demeanor. "Sergeant Parker," Robert Carter said, extending his hand. "Emily's told us about you, about everything you saw in her before anyone else did. Your daughter had the raw material long before I ever met her," Parker said, shaking his hand firmly. "I just helped her recognize what was already there." "She said something similar," Susan Carter added, studying Parker with an expression of genuine gratitude. "That you told her she wasn't defined by the job she was assigned, but by what she does when the moment comes. She proved that better than anyone I've trained in over 20 years. Parker said, glancing toward Emily with something that looked for just a moment almost like fatherly pride. "I don't say that lightly." The gathering continued into the evening, a rare, uncomplicated pocket of celebration amid months that had demanded almost everything Emily had to give. She found herself at one point standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching her parents talk animatedly, with Parker feeling a strange, unfamiliar sense of peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Then a familiar voice broke through her quiet reflection. "You clean up nice, Carter." Emily turned to find Daniel Hayes standing there, fully recovered, his posture strong and confident in a way that stood in stark contrast to the pale, unconscious man she had knelt beside on that hospital bed months earlier. "Daniel." She threw her arms around him without thinking, and he laughed, hugging her back with the easy warmth of someone who had shared something with her that few others could ever fully understand. "I wouldn't have missed this," he said, stepping back to look at her properly. "Sniper school graduate, never doubted it for a second." "You doubted it plenty when I first told you I was applying," Emily reminded him, a teasing smile crossing her face. "I doubted the timeline, not the outcome," Daniel corrected, grinning. "There's a difference." Jake Morrison appeared beside him a moment later, along with Ryan Cole and Mike Alvarez, his shoulder fully healed, and for a moment the entire team that had survived that impossible night on the mountainside stood together again, no longer scattered across a battlefield, fighting for their lives, but gathered in celebration of exactly how far that impossible night had carried them all. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jake said, studying Emily with an expression of genuine, unreserved respect. "Logistics specialist turned sniper school graduate. If someone told me that story a year ago, I wouldn't have believed a word of it." "If someone told me that story a year ago," Emily said, "I definitely wouldn't have believed it either." "How does it feel?" I know, Cole asked. "Officially being what you already proved yourself to be on that mountainside." Emily considered the question carefully, aware that everyone gathered around her was waiting for an answer. Aware, too, that the truthful answer was more complicated than any simple statement of pride or accomplishment could fully capture. "It feels like coming home to a version of myself I didn't know existed," she said finally. "Terrifying and right both at the same time." "That sounds about accurate," Alvarez said, raising a glass in her direction. "To Carter, the logistics girl who saved an entire SEAL team and then decided that wasn't enough and went and became exactly what everyone always underestimated her capable of being. The group raised their glasses together, and Emily felt something settle deep inside her chest, a sense of belonging. She had chased her entire life without ever fully understanding what it would actually feel like to find it. But even amid the celebration, even surrounded by people who had witnessed and shared in the most extraordinary night of her life, Emily understood that the story wasn't finished simply because she had completed her training. Somewhere ahead of her lay deployments, missions, moments that would test everything she had learned in ways training could only partially prepare her for. Somewhere ahead of her lay more nights like that mountainside, more decisions that would demand everything she had to give. She understood this, and rather than fear settling over her at the thought, something steadier took its place. She was ready. Not because the fear had disappeared, not because the memory of that man's face at close range had ever fully faded from the edges of her dreams, but because she had learned through the hardest possible teacher that readiness was never about the absence of fear in the first place. It was about what you did despite it. Months later, Emily found herself assigned to a new unit, her first official posting as a qualified sniper, standing at the edge of a briefing room, preparing for her first sanctioned combat deployment in her new role. She thought as she checked her gear with the same methodical precision that had once made her exceptional at counting bullets in a supply room about everything that had led her to this exact moment. She thought about her father injured and struggling to find purpose after his accident, teaching her without ever fully realizing it that resilience wasn't about avoiding hardship, but about finding a way through it. She thought about her mother exhausted, but never broken, showing her that quiet endurance was its own form of extraordinary strength. She thought about Parker, who had seen something in a quiet logistics specialist that nobody else had bothered to look for, who had spent nearly a year of nights. Nobody understood the value of building the foundation for a moment none of them could have fully anticipated. She thought about Daniel Hayes, whose fallen rifle had changed the entire trajectory of her life, and who had become in the months since one of the closest friends she had ever had. And she thought about that mountainside, about the terror and the desperate, impossible courage it had demanded of her, about the way she had discovered in the worst possible circumstances exactly who she was capable of becoming when everything and everyone around her needed her most. Before boarding the transport that would carry her toward her first deployment as a fully trained sniper, Emily received a final message from Master Sergeant William Parker Brief, but carrying the same weight every piece of wisdom he had ever offered her always seemed to hold. "Remember why you carry it," he had written. "Not for glory, not for recognition, for the people who need you when the moment comes. That's the responsibility. Carry it well." Emily read the message twice, then tucked her phone away and boarded the transport with a steadiness that would have seemed impossible to the woman who had once believed her only value lay in counting ammunition crates in a quiet supply room. She was no longer that woman. She had not abandoned who she once was. The careful, precise, detail-oriented soldier who understood that a missing bullet or a miscounted crate could cost someone their life just as surely as a missed shot in combat. That version of her lived on inside the sniper she had become, informing every calculation, every decision, every moment of discipline that had carried her through the hardest training of her life. But she had also become something else entirely, something forged in the fire of a single impossible night on a mountainside in Afghanistan, when an enemy sniper's bullet found Daniel Hayes and sent his rifle sliding into darkness, and a woman nobody had ever expected to matter beyond a supply manifest made the choice to pick it up. That choice had changed everything. It had cost her something. A piece of innocence she would never fully recover. Images she would carry for the rest of her life, nights that would sometimes still steal her sleep no matter how much time passed. But it had also given her something she never knew. She was searching for a purpose so complete and undeniable that every sacrifice required to earn it felt in the end entirely worth the cost. Emily Carter had spent her entire life believing that some people were simply born to matter, destined for moments of consequence and heroism, while others, people like her, were meant to support from the shadows, essential but invisible, necessary but never celebrated. That mountainside had taught her otherwise. It had taught her that heroism rarely announces itself in advance. It doesn't select the strongest, the loudest, or the most obviously capable. Sometimes it waits quietly in the most overlooked corners of a battlefield, in the hands of a logistics specialist. Counting bullets nobody thought would ever matter, until the exact moment everything depends on someone stepping forward who was never expected to. And when that moment finally comes, when a fallen rifle lies waiting, and every trained warrior around is already locked into their own desperate fight, true courage isn't measured by whether fear exists at all. It's measured entirely by what a person chooses to do despite it. Emily Carter chose to move. And in that single terrifying, impossible decision, she didn't just save the lives of 5 American soldiers on a mountainside in Afghanistan. She discovered exactly who she had always been capable of becoming long before anyone, including herself, ever believed it was possible.